Interesting, but the sound is good.
So you're not wearing pants.
That's not what I meant at all. Get your mind out of the gutter, Nathaniel. Why would you infer that? I just meant I'm drinking water. That's what I meant.
On that lovely note, I will now call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 25 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on June 1st, we are meeting to study the Investment Canada Act. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Again, to remind the members and the witnesses, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, please unmute your microphone and return to mute when you are finished. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly so that the translators can do their work. And please make sure that you are on the language that you will be speaking on the Zoom app. As is my normal practice, I will hold up the yellow card for when you have 30 seconds left in your intervention and the red card from when your time is up. We have two panels today. The first panel will be from 3 to 4 p.m. We will take a break at 4 p.m. so that we can switch out the witnesses as well as a little health break, because we will then go into a 2-hour meeting for the second panel. And with that, I'm not going to read out all of your titles again, as I know that I did that last week. So I want to re-welcome back Mr. Howlig from the Canada Security Intelligence Service, Mr. Davies from the Department of Industry, and from the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Mr. Dominique Rochon. You will have each 5 minutes to testify, followed by the round of questions. And with that, I will start with Mr. Howlig. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, good afternoon. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Requirements at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Amongst other things, my directorate is responsible for the analysis of intelligence that CSIS collects on threats to the security of Canada. Our intelligence assessments and the advice are provided to the government to inform decision-making. I want to thank you for the invitation today to participate in the committee's study on the Investment Canada Act. I want to begin by briefly outlining CSIS's mandate, which is to investigate activities suspected of constituting a threat to the security of Canada, to advise the government of Canada on these threats, and to take measures to reduce these threats. The threats to the security of Canada are defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act as espionage and sabotage, foreign influenced activity, terrorism, and subversion of government through violence. As discussed in our recent public report, state-sponsored economic espionage activities in Canada continue to increase in breadth, depth, and potential economic impact. In order to fulfill their national economic, intelligence, and military interests, some foreign states engage in espionage activities. Foreign espionage has significant economic ramifications for Canada, including lost jobs, intellectual property, and corporate and tax revenues, as well as competitive advantages. With our economic prosperity, our open academic and research communities, Canada offers attractive prospects to foreign investors. Although foreign investment is a key driver of Canada's economic prosperity, it also has the potential, in certain cases, to adversely affect our national security. The acquisition of sensitive intellectual property, technology, or vast amounts of Canadian citizens' private data for foreign use or with foreign state control can threaten national security. While the vast majority of the foreign investment in Canada is carried out in an open and transparent manner, some state-owned enterprises and private firms with suspected or known ties to their government and or intelligence services can pursue corporate acquisition bids in Canada or other economic activities on a non-commercial basis and for their own strategic objectives. Foreign states have engaged in espionage and foreign interference targeting Canada for years. This is not new activity. CSIS Director Vigneault has spoken publicly about the impact of these threats to Canada's economy and national interest, including the threats posed by China and Russia. In its 2019 review of foreign interference and public report, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of parliamentarians also reflect that these, among other states, are of concern. While I cannot speak in detail about any operational matters, I can assure you that CSIS is actively investigating all suspected threats of foreign interference and espionage, and we engage with your NSI COP colleagues on these important matters in a classified space. These threats pose particular concern during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has created economic vulnerabilities for Canadian companies upon which foreign threat actors may seek to capitalize. To assess such impacts, the ICA authorizes the government to review foreign investments on national security grounds. CSIS is a prescribed investigative body under the national security provisions of the ICA. As such, the service conducts investigative efforts related to national security concerns arising from foreign investments linked to foreign government entities. CSIS obviously works with other government departments and agencies, including Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, the Department of National Defence, Communications and Security Establishment, and the RCMP, to provide the advice in support of national security review process. While I cannot comment publicly on any specific advice that CSIS has provided on any specific ICA transaction, I would note that it's ultimately within the prerogative of the Governor in Council to allow, disallow, or impose mitigation measures on investments that would be injurious to national security. Corporate acquisition is not the only way through which hostile actors can threaten Canada's economic security. Threat actors can also access proprietary government information through cyber attacks, espionage, and insider threats. Insiders are individuals with direct access to the systems and intellectual property in corporate and research environments, potentially including business people, scientists, and researchers. Put another way, today's spies also wear lab coats and not just trench coats. CSIS observes that technology and know-how, particularly in academia and small to medium enterprises, is often less protected and more vulnerable to state-sponsored espionage. Thank you very much. That ends my opening comments.
Thank you very much. And we'll now go to Mr. Davies. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to discuss the Investment Canada Act related to the committee study. I'm the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of the Industry Sector for Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada and Deputy Director of Investments, responsible for supporting the Director of Investments and advising the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry on the Investment Canada Act. In my brief opening remarks, I would like to provide background to the committee on how we administer the Act, including the current context shaped by COVID-19. As has been widely recognized, foreign direct investment, or FDI, plays an important role in the development of Canada's economy, contributing to productivity, providing vital links to global value chains. It fuels innovation and creates well-paying jobs. FDI will be an important component as the economy recovers from the effects of the pandemic. At the same time, the government has a responsibility to ensure that FDI benefits Canada and to protect Canadians against national security threats that can arise through foreign investment. With respect to how the authorities in the Act are administered, information about decisions is made public through an annual report on the ICA, including disclosure of summary statistics on the operation of the net benefit and national security review processes. The government's net benefit review authorities are based on the value of the Canadian business. Based on the recommendations of a blue ribbon panel in 2008, successive governments have raised the net economic benefit review threshold for private WTO and trade agreement investors. The threshold now stands at $1.613 billion in enterprise value for private investors from Canada's trade agreement partners, $1.075 billion for private investors from other WTO investors, while it is at $428 million in asset value for state-owned WTO investors. These amounts are updated each calendar year in accordance with changes in nominal GDP. The top three source countries or regions of investors by number of ICA filings were the United States at 59%, the European Union at 24%, and China as a third at 4%. The United States and the European Union have been historically Canada's largest investors under the Act. Additionally, all foreign investments, regardless of value, regardless of the investor or country of origin, are subject to review under the Act's national security review process. Threats to national security are complex and evolving. Accordingly, the ICA and its associated regulations do not define national security. However, to provide transparency for investors and Canadian businesses, the government published National Security Review Guidelines in December of 2016. These guidelines are complementary to the national security provisions of the Act. Recognizing the unique challenges brought about by COVID-19, on April 18, 2020, the Minister issued a policy statement which indicates that the government will apply enhanced scrutiny under both the net benefit and national security provisions of the ICA to foreign investments related to public health or in the supply of critical goods and services. In addition, given that investments into Canada by state-owned enterprises may be motivated by non-commercial imperatives that could harm Canada's economic or national security interests, the statement indicates that all foreign investments by state-owned investors will be subject to enhanced scrutiny under the ICA. Enhanced scrutiny could involve the Minister requesting additional information during the course of a review or an extended review timelines in order to ensure that the government can fully assess these investments. The goal of the statement was to inform foreign investors that we would exercise these authorities to their utmost with a focus to preserve net benefits to Canada of proposed investments and to protect Canada's national security. In particular, the review processes would consider closely the effect of proposed transactions on potential risks to the supply of critical goods and services during the period of the pandemic. This approach under the ICA, including as articulated in the COVID-19 policy statement, is consistent with general intelligence assessments shared by the national security departments and agencies. I am pleased that my colleagues from Public Safety Canada and the National Security and Intelligence Service are with me here today to speak to the important roles their organizations play in the administration of the national security provisions of the Act. Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to answer any questions the members may have. I should note that I'm unable to speak to or respond to specific questions with respect to specific investment reviews due to the strict confidentiality provisions of the Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davies. And our next guest is Mr. Rochon. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to discuss the Investment Canada Act, and good afternoon, everyone. I am the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of the National and Cybersecurity Branch here at Public Safety Canada, responsible, among other things, for advising the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness Canada on the national security dimensions of the ICA. My remarks will follow on the national security provisions under the ICA, which is administered by the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, as we just heard, who consults with the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness Canada as part of his deliberations. The national security provisions of the ICA are broad by design and enable Canada to assess all inbound foreign investments, including the establishment of a new Canadian business or an entity carrying on operations in Canada, the acquisition of control of a Canadian business of any dollar value, and the acquisition of all or part of an entity carrying on operations in Canada. National security is not explicitly defined within the ICA, as this allows the government to remain nimble in response to the ever-changing threat environment. Public Safety Canada manages a national security review process in collaboration with 18 departments and agencies. And as we heard Mr. Hollowig point out, this ranges from CSIS, the Communication Security Establishment, the Department of National Defence, or the RCMP, and Global Affairs Canada, to Natural Resources Canada, the Public Health Agency, and the Department of Finance. This whole-of-government approach brings the relevant expertise to bear as we assess the national security risks of each transaction. The review takes into account a variety of factors, including the potential effects of Canada's defence capabilities and interests, the potential effects on the transfer of sensitive technology or know-how outside of Canada, involvement in the research, manufacture, or sale of goods, technology important to Canada's national defence, the potential impact on the security of Canada's critical infrastructure, the potential to enable foreign surveillance and espionage, the potential to hinder current or future intelligence or law enforcement operations, the potential impact on Canada's international interests, including foreign relationships, and the potential to involve or facilitate the activities of illicit actors, such as terrorists, terrorist organizations, or organized crime. In light of COVID-19, we've also applied increased scrutiny to all foreign direct investments in Canadian businesses that are vital to public health and the security of supply of critical goods. The National Security Review is rigorous with multiple steps and thresholds that must be met before taking action. Unlike many countries, Canada has a mandatory notification scheme where an investor must let the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development know when they establish or take control of a company. The process begins once we become aware of a transaction with a preliminary assessment of all filings and information sharing among partners. If there are reasonable grounds to believe that the investment could be injurious to national security, the process moves into a notice period with a 45-day window for the community to investigate concerns. If, after this period, concerns remain that the transaction could be injurious to national security, a national security review is ordered by the Governor and Council on the recommendation of the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry after consultation with the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness Canada. The National Security Review period provides Canada with another 45 calendar days with an optional 45-day extension to investigate whether this investment would be injurious to national security. So in total, from receipt of notification to recommendation to Cabinet, the process can take up to 200 days. Further extensions, of course, may also be granted with the investor's consent. At the end of the National Security Review period, the government has three options. If it is determined that the investment does not meet the threshold of would be injurious to national security, the investment is allowed to proceed. If the government determines that an investment meets the threshold, then it may decide to either A, allow it subject to the imposition of mitigation measures to address residual risk, or B, order that the investment be blocked if it hasn't been implemented yet, or divested if it has been implemented. To conclude, the National Security Review process is a robust one, involving a multitude of investigative bodies that work collaboratively to ensure Canada is safeguarded against national security threats that can arise through foreign direct investments. Madam Chair, I would be pleased to now answer questions that members may have, and I'll offer up the same disclaimer as my colleague from ISED, in that I may be unable to speak or respond to questions related to specific investment reviews that are currently underway or that have taken place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll now start our round of questions. Our first round of questions goes to MP Rempel Gardner. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start by directing my questions to Mr. Hollweg. I'll start by pointing to a part of the department's 2019 report that discusses SOEs with, quote, close ties to their government and or intelligence services and acquisition bids and economic activity in Canada. The report says specifically corporate acquisitions by these entities pose potential risks related to vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, control over strategic sectors, espionage, foreign influenced activities, and illegal transfer of technology and expertise. I'm just interested in which countries you are referring to within this section of the report.
Thank you, Mary, very much for the question. So, as stated in the public report and as indicated by our director in public, there are many countries of concern in this space. I specifically noted Russia and China. NSI COP review of 2019 also reflects that those two states or those two countries are countries of concern, but there are others. Foreign interference and economic espionage has been around for a long time in this country, unfortunately, and we are bringing all of our investigative efforts to bear to make sure we identify those countries and advise the government in a proactive manner.
Can you provide the committee with a list of recent SOE acquisitions in Canada that raise these specific concerns noted in your report?
Unfortunately, given the unclassified nature of this committee and this conversation today, I can't get into any specific SOE acquisitions and talk about any specific cases.
Can you table with the committee perhaps a table that has country number of acquisitions that you noted or that would have led to this recommendation?
Yep, I would defer to my my colleagues from either public safety or ISED to comment on. I believe they would have those numbers from specific countries.
Thank you. Has CSIS noticed any use of shell companies that are heavily influenced or connected to undemocratic countries? What I'm trying to get at here is if your department has flagged the use of shell companies or companies that may be from a country that we wouldn't necessarily flag, but that has been owned or significantly owned by an authoritarian government. Is this something that has come up frequently in your review?
It's a very good question. I can't speak to specific operational matters and get into any specific details, but I can tell you that acquisitions by shell companies, state-owned enterprises, or ones directly linked to intelligence services or foreign governments are the ones that we focus our energy and our attention on, specifically related to the sectors that were already discussed. The threat landscape changes, as you can imagine, frequently, and we have to make sure that we're alive to what those current threats are and making sure that we're focused on the right sectors to make sure that we can inform the government appropriately.
Just to the panel as a whole, I have heard concerns that because some of the screening that happens under the ICA happens under a division of global affairs that is also responsible for promotion of trade, that this might be an actual conflict of interest within the government department. Do you think that the responsibility for screening should be separated out from any department that has responsibility for the promotion of trade?
Madam Chair, if I could address the question. The screening process in part is initiated by the notices, some 900 notices that are received under the Investment Canada Act each year, over 900 last fiscal year. Those are all made available in the system to our investigative bodies, so they are able to come to their own conclusions.
So that is not the question I asked. I said, do you think that there's a conflict of interest with having screening happen in a department that also has a mandate or deliverable where they're measured on the attraction of trade and FDI?
Madam Chair, in this case, the two ministers involved in the process are the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of ISED, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. Those are the two ministers who are involved in the identification of cases which notices need to be offered, and also the recommendation of the Governing Council. So,
thank you.
To the extent that's a strong process that's built into the law.
Also, I note that there's a difference between a security screening and a security review. How many cases go through a security screening versus a security review, and what's the threshold?
So, Madam Chair, I'll just start, and then my colleagues may wish to comment. I mentioned over 900 notices received under the Investment Canada Act in the last fiscal year. All of those notices are part of the information. Those are then reviewed to determine which ones are prioritized.
So that was not helpful. I guess the problem here is that there seems to be gaps in how we screen versus review, and we don't have department officials that are prepared to answer those questions. So I guess we'll just have to recommend policy to the contrary, and I know that my time is up. It's difficult. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next round of questions goes to MP Longfield. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the great presentations from our witnesses. I'm going to start with Mr. Rochon. I've been looking at the ICA annual report, and in it, on page 5, they talk about the national security provisions that allow for a broad review that could be considered national security. Is this in line with comparator jurisdictions, or do they not have a provision and they might want to introduce more broad terms in terms of being able to be fluid to risks?
Thank you for the question, and I'll allow my colleague from ISED to weigh in terms of comparators to what we're seeing in other countries. If I understand your question, I feel that the review process that we have, I guess I would need more specificity in terms of what you're after, in terms of when you're saying broad review. I feel like the way that the provisions are set up in Canada, that we certainly have leeway to look at every aspect of national security. So what, if you could provide further specificity to what you're after?
Sure. I'm thinking of the thresholds that might trigger a review, either a percentage of ownership or the value of the investment, to broaden the sector coverage of a review. What I'm saying is the more specificity we put, the more we limit the type of review we would be doing, and whether that compares to and sure, Mr. Davies, if you have a comment, that would be great.
Yeah, no, thank you, Madam Chair. I think I just make clear that on the national security review provisions, we're talking about a very, very broad set of provisions where there's no dollar value. The definition of national security is left to the discretion of the government to assess based on the evolution of events and to take full account of current circumstances, which is an integral part of the Act. The other thing is it's really on a case-by-case basis, and the notification process also provides for information to come into our system on all new businesses that are established and all control takeovers that are initiated. And then we also can reach out and look into any investment which may well be under the scope of the Act and pull those investments in for scrutiny. So it's quite a broad base. And in fact, a number of countries are moving towards this model, which provides quite a wide aperture in order to screen investments across a range of different types of investments. And there is no sectoral restriction in this regard. It's wide open in that sense.
Thank you, and that's really where I was wondering and wanting to get a testimony on, is in terms of keeping our options open in terms of emerging threats that may not be included if we get too specific. Maybe Mr. Davies, if I could stay with you on what actually happens then if a state-owned enterprise is in violation of the agreement by not being transparent or violation of the guidelines or the net benefit assessment. What happens on the other side if they're able to get through the process but then are in contradiction of what they said they were going to be doing?
Yeah, so in general, I would describe the process as providing, and this is depending on the net benefit or the national security process in the Act, because the state-owned enterprise guidelines apply to both, but of course there's also different considerations. In terms of net benefit, the matter that's looked at is the corporate practices, the transparency, and the commercial orientation of the businesses. And that can be assessed in cases where we're looking at net benefit to Canada for the economy. And we can secure commitments if an investment is to be allowed to proceed, that the minister wishes to allow it, we can secure commitments, and then those are enforceable. In terms of national security, of course, it goes much, much broader, and the degree to which different considerations are brought to bear. But those investments, if they are allowed, and this is a question, could be allowed on the basis of a variety of mitigating measures, which would be enforceable on the investor on an ongoing basis. So the Act provides for the upfront process of review and engagement with the investor, and then also subsequent processes to follow up on adherence to commitments if commitments have been accepted as part of the process.
Right, and that could include shell companies or other things that could be used to try to hide information.
I think, Madam Chair, I would actually add to an answer previously given that when you talk about shell companies, the minister has the authority and does exercise this to seek full disclosure of the ultimate controller of any investor, right, which is to say we will look at the party that's initiating the investment of the Act, but then always look up all the way through the chain of control to right, the ultimate owner. And in fact, the minister's determinations as to the control of that enterprise and whether or not it is or is not a state-owned enterprise can look in that in a very expansive way. So I think that should help with some of the information that's been provided so far.
Great, thank you. And then finally, I'll just stay with you. We've got about a minute left. In the annual report, it talks about improvements in 2016 and 2017 to the National Security Review. What were these improvements? Was it increasing transparency or review methods or both?
So in terms of legislative terms, changes have been made and regulatory changes have been made to allow for a longer review period. So the 200-day maximum for national security review. We also have added disclosures in the public reporting on which reviews have been undertaken, the country of origin, and also the outcome of those reviews to provide more information.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's your time.
Okay.
Notre prochaine tour.
Our next speaker will be Minister Lemire. You have 6 minutes, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This has been very instructive. I've learned a good deal. I found this very interesting so far, and I've actually taken a good deal of notes. Mr. Devise, you mentioned the thresholds, the fact that governments have raised these thresholds over the years. Currently, in the context of the COVID crisis and the valuation of our businesses, if our businesses were to be devalued in the current situation, are we at greater risk? Are our businesses at greater risk? And should we, perhaps, given the context, lower these thresholds to ensure that Canadian businesses are protected? Merci, Madame.
First, in terms of the dollar thresholds in the Act, those apply to the net benefit provisions. They do not apply to the national security provisions. Any dollar value investment can be examined under those provisions. So no change in the market valuation of any Canadian business would affect the national security review process at all. In terms of the other provisions, if it's an investment by a state-owned enterprise, recall that the investment is reviewable over $428 million based on asset value, and that is not revised off of the books of the company. So even in the current circumstances, changes in asset values would not change the threshold in any real terms. So I'd mention that in reference to the concern that the honourable members raised.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. Mr. Agwal, I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Here's my question. You mentioned, here's my question. What criteria or mechanism really triggers your involvement? According to you, do you think the current ICA is sufficient, or should we give it more teeth and give you more power to better protect our economy and our companies?
For the question. What triggers CSIS's involvement? If something comes to light from a national security concern, I had mentioned out the outset in my opening comments as well that from a security perspective, the lens keeps changing. But right now, we're quite concerned from a national security perspective of those state-owned enterprises that are linked directly to certain countries and or their respective intelligence organizations. When those hit on sectors of concern, and again, those threat landscapes change as well, but we're talking about critical infrastructure, emerging technologies. We're talking about organizations which hold significant amounts of personal information on Canadians, such as financial and health records. So the combination of two, from a service perspective, is worrisome from a national security perspective. In terms of whether or not we need to be bolstered more from a security perspective to do more, I would say that as a prescriptive organization in the ICA process that does the investigations, we do not comment on policy and or make policy recommendations. We're strictly focused on the security aspects and conducting those investigations to inform government. So I would defer those, your second question, to my colleagues from ISED or Public Safety, but thank you for your question.
Peut-être rapidement.
Perhaps quickly, you might. Well, I'll move on to my next question, which will be for Mr. Davies. Given that we are reviewing the ICA, I think it would be smart to strengthen the part about those involved, consumers, shareholders, the government, and the environment. among others, to really make sure that's really clearly stated in the Investment Canada Act. And it has been said, it's quite important, that a new IP should be protected, given that intellectual property is really at the center of current commerce. So what mechanisms should we adopt to ensure that we protect the modern economy of Canada and Quebec?
In reference to the question and the earlier testimony, which we did note, I think it's important to take into consideration the changes made under the Investment Canada Act after a previous review. Changed the basis for valuation to enterprise value, which what that does is it captures the value, the market value of the intellectual property of the business. Previously, an asset-based threshold only would not capture that. So now, in fact, the type of enterprise that is largely valued based on its IP, that obviously then can see that there's a net benefit review conducted in certain circumstances where the threshold is exceeded. In terms of national security, of course, all matters that might relate to important intellectual property and any national security related risks around that can be assessed by the investigative agencies as part of a review, notwithstanding the extent of the investment or the dollar value.
Merci. Dernière question.
Thank you. A final question very quickly for Mr. Rochon. When you say that the options are either to accept it or to I'll call for mitigation measures or to block or prohibit the investment, should this be considered in greater depth for Canadians, adding transparency to this? Very quickly, please. Very quickly.
Thank you for the question, and I think we have enough transparency in place with regard to reporting on decisions that are being made through annual reporting and such. Obviously, national security matters do have a certain level of classification that needs to be respected.
Merci, thank you. Our next round of questions goes to MP Massé. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hoping this microphone is good for our interpreters. Good. Thank you to the House of Common Services as quickly as they are. My first question is to CSIS. With regards to investment in Canada, we have a good chart here from our researchers that shows the vast majority comes from the United States, then Netherlands and Luxembourg is third on the list. There's a few others, but I'm just kind of curious, is there any screening that's done about, I guess in general, about where the investment's coming from? And I have a subsequent question to that. But do you look at nation states as well too? Like I'm surprised that Luxembourg is third, and I'm just wondering whether or not there's also a lens beyond the person, but also where they come from in terms of the company.
Thank you very much for the question. I can tell you that regardless of where it comes from, if there's any security threat or any suspected impact on our national security, then we will review it in that lens and put all of our investigative efforts to bear on that. So it really doesn't matter where the investment comes from. For us, as one of the investigative bodies, it's the potential injurious impact of that threat actor. I can tell you in the foreign interference space and economic espionage space, I'm often quoted as saying our best defense is education. And that's why I'm super proud of the service and our outreach efforts, especially in the pandemic space, where we're getting out there and being proactive with companies in the biopharmaceutical space, in the health sciences space, and we're actually giving them information on what threat actors might actually come at them so that they can put their own mitigation efforts in place. That's been very successful. And as a matter of fact, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had a talk with biotech, which represents a lot of the biopharma industry, very well received, and we will continue with those outreach efforts as much as we can.
So as I move down the list, so that kind of answers what but there's still a little bit more to it. So we go down the list a little farther, and you have United Kingdom, Switzerland, Japan, Hong Kong, China, Bermuda, and Brazil. But given what's taken place in Hong Kong right now and China, they are respectively 6th and 7th on the list, but you add them up together and they move up quite well. Would there be further work being done on, say, for example, with this investment coming from Hong Kong? in the state of affairs that are taking place, and the second, largest after them is China. Would there be extra kind of a analysis, or is there not, I guess, field work or anything you can highlight about? Because that would give me concern. Bermuda is really interesting. I'm willing to bet we're getting a lot of Bermuda money coming in because it's a tax haven. That's aside from Hong Kong, but perhaps the Hong Kong, if you could answer that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I can't get into specific operational reasons. In the secure space, I'm very glad that we have your NSI COP colleagues that we engage with to talk about these specific threat actors. I did mention China and Russia specifically, as they have been noted in the public forum before, but I can tell you that the nature of the threat prescribes how much effort we put against looking at this from an investigative perspective, and then providing that advice to the government, who then ultimately takes the decision.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Rochon, one of the biggest buyouts that we have in Canada is our manufacturing sector. And we saw with COVID-19, the response where I'm from, the auto sector, is diminished quite a bit, but we still have capacity there. And one of the plants that is now producing PPE was one that was actually, we had to fight to keep open a number of years ago. Is there any kind of a lens happening now, or an analysis of our manufacturing? It's been shrinking as part of our economy significantly over the last number of years. It's pretty much vulnerable. And then what we have left over is often branch plants where they're owned and operated and managed for the most part for product realignment from other countries. Is there anything related to that is being determined, or at least re-examined, in the lens of not having decision making for PPE?
Thank you for the question. What I would say is, from a national security threat perspective, and it sort of dovetails to the question you were referring to my CSIS colleague a moment ago. Obviously, national security covers a broad swath of areas, and in light of the pandemic that we just went through, all of a sudden, issues of manufacturing in personal protective equipment, or indeed biopharma, has increased in terms of interest. So analysis is being done when it comes to investment in those areas, absolutely. So that comes to bear in terms of our analysis when we're looking at various investments to decide whether or not they pose a threat to supply chains or things of that nature.
Yeah, okay. And does that also include a little bit of the competition lens? I've often advocated, I think my time's running out, but I'm sure you're saying updating our competition laws. Is there a little bit of a competition lens put on that? Because we could have maybe a lack of movement to produce things because they don't want to increase competition with if it's a foreign subsidiary operation.
From a competition perspective, I think I'll defer to my colleague at ISED, Mr. Davies.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's an important question. The role of manufacturing, obviously we've counted on our manufacturers to help produce these critical equipment in this particular time. And I would say also, just in terms of foreign investment, we do have to realize that some of those large foreign investments are anchoring as well our supply base, our small businesses, which have came to, more or less to our rescue, right, to produce necessary equipment. So there's a relationship between these things.
Thank you so much. We'll now move to the second round, and a gentle reminder, we're very tight on time to respect the cards. MP Gray, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions today are for CSIS. In 2016, concerns were raised about the purchase of Invest Real Estate by a company called Blue Sky. The Financial Post reported that Blue Sky may have connections to a Chinese state-owned enterprise, Anbag. And the Financial Post also stated that the CEO of Blue Sky said that she was representing Anbag, but it didn't want to be named as the buyer. Mr. Hellweg, do you think transparency in the use of intermediaries in these acquisitions is a gap that should be better addressed by the Investment Canada Act?
It's a great question. I'm going to have to defer part of that question to my colleagues from ISED and potentially public safety. I can say that it is obviously a concern from a national security lens if people are trying to obfuscate their original intent or their goals in this area. And this is why we put a lot of efforts from a service perspective in terms of investigating these types of things. But I would defer to my colleagues from ISED regarding the other part of your question, because I cannot speak to any specific transaction.
No, fair enough. If we may, actually, just because I have limited time here, rather than flipping back and forth, that does eat up time. So I'll just maybe go through a couple other questions first, if I may. Does CSIS consider keeping Canadians' data stored within Canada versus companies storing them abroad? What is your opinion on that with respect to national security?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the scope of your question. Obviously, protecting Canadian data is hugely important for national security. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is a concern for us that we highlight in all of our public report and all of our talk on economic espionage. It's something that is one of the primary sectors that we want to protect.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think part of this context is when we're talking about potentially, hotels. So, the data owned by a hotel, and if that hotel is owned by an SOE, would that be more at risk for espionage?
I'm not sure if it would be more specifically at risk. It would depend on the circumstances, but I can tell you that having a broad range of Canadian data, going back to my original comments, going to an SOE, which is linked to another country's intelligence organization, is problematic from a national security perspective.
Okay, in your 2019 report, CSIS touched on potential risks to control of strategic sectors. So would you consider Canada's hotel and hospitality sector strategic?
I don't know about strategic. I would turn that question to my colleague Dominic Rochon, but for our perspective and our lens, organizations which hold significant amounts of personal information on Canadians, as I mentioned, critical infrastructure, that includes telecommunications, transportation, and energy sectors, but also emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum information processing, and semiconductors. That's our principal concern right now from a service perspective.
Okay. Are there any other potential national security risks that can arise from a foreign state-owned enterprise-backed corporation owning a hotel real estate chain in Canada, for example? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I couldn't speak to the specific operational areas of that, but I could say generally that anytime we have a state-owned enterprise that has their own national interest advanced and put it in the fore as opposed to Canadian interest, that would be problematic.
Okay. Some experts have said, or they've called on the government to start a registry for those who lobby or communicate on behalf of foreign principals to influence Canadian government policy. Would you say that implementing such a registry would be a step in the right direction for transparency?
Again, that's a policy consideration, and I would turn to my colleagues in ISED for that.
Okay. Well, do you have any recommendations for us today on the Investment Canada Act while you have the floor?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So the recommendation, again, as I indicated, is we will continue to investigate. We are very engaged with our domestic and our foreign partners in this space. We're very active in this space, but as I mentioned, I think getting out there proactively and educating anybody that's in this space and anybody that's in a vulnerable sector, I think, is critical.
Thank you very much. Our next round is MP Johari. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank to the witnesses. I'm going to start with CSIS and Mr. Hollweg. Mr. Hollweg, on the submission that you had made, which due to shortage of time, you only had an opportunity to read the first sentence of the whole paragraph, and I'll read the paragraph to you, and I'd like to get your input on that. In your submission, you state that CSIS observes that technology and know-how, particularly in academic and small to medium enterprises, is often less protected and more vulnerable to state-sponsored espionage. The national security community and the business community have a shared interest in raising public awareness regarding the scope and nature of state-sponsored espionage against Canada and its potential effect on our economic growth and ability to innovate. Mr. Hollweg, can you expand How I understand raising awareness is important, but how does that work into the national security review and the guideline, whether it's the review or whether it's assessment? How does what you just stated works into it, or it's taken into an account?
I think it's a great question, and I thank you for that question. By educating people that are in vulnerable sectors, or especially now in the COVID context, if we use the biopharma example and we continue with that, that education piece and that outreach is critical for these companies to know that, and be aware when they might be vulnerable to attack. Once they are armed with that information, they can start to spot signs, and then they can get in touch with the government to say, I think there's something going on here. You might want to review this. So that education piece kickstarts everything, because we're only alive to the threats when they're brought to our attention. So that's the importance of that outreach.
Great. I'd like to take Mr. Davis' input on that. Mr. Davis? Yeah, especially on the innovation.
I would say, in particular, with so many small, medium-sized enterprises with a lot of really interesting technology in Canada, that these types of businesses, one, may not have the significant corporate resources to make the assessments sometimes that might be required, and of course that's important. They're also lacking often in financial resources and often needing investment. So I think that in some ways, keeps the doors open, and then people come into the doors and make offers and so forth.
And that's exactly when I wanted to go, where you stated, you took the word out of my mouth when you said that they don't have not only the financial resources, but also the capacity to be able to do this. If you're talking about a small business, SME, who is anywhere from, 10 to 15 people, and they're focusing on, let's say, innovation, and they're focusing on environment, they may not have the capacity to be. So how do we safeguard against it?
Yeah, I would actually say that the committee's study, the committee's review of this is timely and important in that regard to raise awareness. My colleague from the service has also mentioned extensive efforts being undertaken by CSIS to get out there, talk to Canadian business, and of course we do that in partnership with them and support them in that, because we have many connections to the business sector, and I think it's something
for us to be able to get out and talk to the small businesses. Naturally, we need the partnership from all the different departments that's being discussed. Do you think there is enough? Is that in the mandate, and is there a sufficient funding exist to be able to go do this, or do we need to go back and advocate for the education as well as the funding for the departments to be able to spearhead that?
Well, certainly, I would say that the advocacy is important. I made that comment. There was also in a budget, I believe 2 years ago, my colleagues might remember the exact budget. There was additional resources added to the system for the investment review process, very much aimed at strengthening the overall network in government that does this work, recognizing its importance.
Mr. Roshan, I see you nodding. Can you chime in? I only got about 30 seconds.
Yes, well, one aspect that you didn't, we also do outreach at public safety, and part of that outreach is with our provincial and territorial friends, of course. So educating individuals at the forefront of investment attraction or securities is part of our mandate. And as Mr. Davies pointed out, the government did invest in economic security writ large, putting in, I believe it was something like $67 million. And the ICA is but one tool. We have export controls, we have Controls Good Act, we have the banking sector, the Bank Act. So there are other controls in place. Economic security is a suite of efforts, including raising awareness.
Thank you, Ahmad.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Rempel-Gardner. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Davies, has the government advised your department to provide any recommendations on potentially lowering the threshold for review on the ICA?
So the question of lowering the threshold, if you're speaking of the dollar thresholds that apply in terms of WTO or a free trade agreement or SOE, those
specifically for the net benefit.
Yeah, that would be the part of the act where there are dollar thresholds. There's important trade implications.
Has the government provided
trade law implications?
Just straight yes or no. Has the government advised you to undertake any work to lower that threshold? Or conversely, has your department provided advice to the government that that's something they should be undertaking?
So I would answer, Madam Chair, that Canada's made a number of commitments in trade agreements in terms of the openness of its trade regime, and it's a ratchet provision. Helpful. Well,
I was looking for yes or no, Mr. Davies.
There are legal issues with respect to reducing the limits.
I just was looking at a yes or no in light of COVID. Has the government directed your department, or have you provided advice to the department that the definition of state-owned enterprise should be broadened to sort of look at state-influenced enterprises or have a greater scrutiny on shell companies?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. The definition in the Act is actually quite broad. It encompasses direct and indirect influence of individuals, and it allows the minister to make a determination after taking account of all the facts. In fact, if you ask the members of the bar, I believe you've had a number of them before you, they would probably say that that's quite an open provision, and it's actually one that we would allow. Well, it's a quite broad provision as it's structured now.
Thank you. Mr. Hallweg, has your department advised the government that there should be certain countries in which Canada is providing, should be or Industry Canada or any department should be providing greater scrutiny of corporate acquisitions given the current global context at this time?
So thank you for the question. There are a number of threat actors out there, as I've noted, and so within the classified space with your NSI colleagues, we do have those discussions about the countries that are potentially problematic. Foreign interference cuts the swath, and we've been subject to foreign interference and economic espionage for a number of years.
To your knowledge, has the government acted on your recommendations?
I can't comment specifically on that because it does impact operational considerations.
You make our jobs pretty difficult, I gotta say. I guess I would say, to any of the, I guess to Mr. Davies, has your department provided any advice to the government to enact either legislative change or regulatory change to provide greater scrutiny on state-owned enterprise acquisition or state-influenced acquisition from countries that may have been flagged either by CSIS or public safety?
I would, Madam Chair, the minister's policy statement, which was made in April, was to provide very much that direction. Investments from state-owned enterprises, investments that might encompass investments in healthcare related to public health, critical goods would be subject to enhanced scrutiny. So I would say that is a direct response.
What does enhanced scrutiny mean?
As I said in my opening comments, Madam Chair, it could involve more questions in the area of looking into the potential impact on the health system, critical infrastructure, the supply chains that are so important to Canadians right now. It could lengthen the time of the review process, and obviously we want to signal to investors that if you're contemplating a sale, you should take that into account.
With the time that I have left on enforcement, an investment might be approved with promises from the company or conditions put in place by the government, but there seems to be little enforcement of those conditions. Has the department provided any advice to the government, Mr. Davies, to propose legislation or a stronger regulatory framework to enforce conditions placed on SOEs that might be acquisitions that might be approved by cabinet?
Madam Chair, it's of course a policy question. In terms of the direction appropriately, you'd ask that question of the minister as to any policy changes that might be considered with the Act. Right
I
now,
asked if your department had provided advice. I asked if your department had provided advice to the minister on that.
So we administer the Act and ensure to its enforcement and work in that regard. And there's a penalty system under the Act, the ability to
a very frustrating line of questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The next round goes to MP Lambropoulos. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us today. My first question is actually for anybody who can answer it. Are there currently any measures in place to investigate whether or not foreign investors are influencing the companies that are trying to invest in Canada? The ones that are not as obvious. as obviously influenced by state-owned by the state in different countries?
Let me jump in. I think anyone can answer the question, but the truth of the matter is whenever there is a potential flag that is raised on any potential investment, we're looking at whether there's a vulnerability, and we're looking at whether or not the actor in the case, as the case may be, poses a threat. So it's on a case-by-case basis. As we look at the areas of concern, vulnerabilities, we will assess them each on their own merit.
Thank you. And Mr. Hallweg, you had mentioned that you only really investigate these when a threat is brought to your attention. How exactly are threats brought to your attention? Are they really brought to you by the ministries, or do you find out in other ways as well?
It's a great question. As part of the ICA process, obviously we're very engaged from a national security community with DND, with RCMP and other people. So we have a lot of different government departments where that threat information may emerge. And then we have those discussions as to whether or not they meet something that we need to investigate further. That could be driven by public safety, it could be driven by ISED themselves or the service. So it comes from a lot of different areas. And we can also, given our investigative mandate, come up with some of these on our own as well.
Thank you very much. I believe my next question is for Mr. Rochon. Can you please tell us what you had mentioned earlier, that the Investment Canada Act is quite broad in order to give the minister the power to investigate whatever he sees as a threat. Can you please tell us what are all of the benefits of keeping it broad and not having some kind of a baseline?
Well, indeed, the truth of the matter is that national security needs to be flexible, because what is a threat today may not have been one last year. And the best illustration of that is, as we were talking with Mr. Massé earlier, personal protective equipment, for example. Some company investing in a manufacturing company that is developing that a year ago would not have popped up on anyone's radar, but now it does fall into play with regard to supply chains and dealing with pandemics, for example. So national security needs to be flexible. And to answer or to expand on the comment that Mr. Hallweg just made, Natural Resources Canada may talk about critical minerals, for example. Health Canada may talk about supply chains for vaccines. At Public Safety, we're particularly interested in sensitive technologies like artificial intelligence or quantum computing. So different departments have different areas of expertise that can flag certain things that are of importance to national security. And with that flexibility, we're then able to turn our attention to various investments to decide whether or not there needs to be mitigation or action taken with regard to any potential investment.
Thank you. And my final question goes to all of our witnesses. Do you know of have you noticed any gaps in the Investment Canada Act, and do you recommend anything that can strengthen the Act? As I'm sure that you can, working with it on a daily basis, you can probably think of ways that we can strengthen it. What are those ways?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll take a start at that question. I think, and I'm going to refer back. I can't underemphasize the importance of awareness. And this act is such that it's meant to be used as a reserve instrument, where perhaps measures haven't been taken by the parties involved that might take into account Canada's interest, particularly in the area of security. The more parties are able to take that into account in their planning, the more they're going to follow down investment transactions that they can actually see through. To encounter a review and a notice from us and a review process that disallows an investment is very disruptive. So in other words, society has to take this on board, and actually we need to have a general awareness that is increased so that actually the transactions that are going on are obviously rewarding and helpful for those businesses, but also respect national security interests that are very important as well. So awareness is not a minor matter. It may not necessarily all be a question of the nature of the law. It's actually what happens before you encounter the law.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Notre prochain tour est député.
Our next round, MP Lemire. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking the time for giving me time to go through the second round. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to sit on the Finance Committee where CRA representatives testified. I asked them questions on tax havens to see where they were investigating, to make sure that there weren't any fraudulent or tax evasion strategies. And to my surprise, they named a country I wasn't expecting, Luxembourg. I was very surprised to see this on number 3 in the chart that the Library of Parliament gave us today. Looking at this list, you take Switzerland, China, Bermuda. All of these countries seem to be, well, their national interest might not be the same as Canada's. Coming back to Luxembourg, should we not question the interests of this country if it's third in terms of investment, but it is under investigation by CRA?
And thank you for bringing that to us, to our attention. I will note that CRA is one of the 19 departments and agencies that are at the table when we review items for national security. I guess a lot of the nature of the questions that you're asking us is whether or not something warrants a proactive look at a specific area, for example, a specific country or a specific issue. The way that the national security provisions work is that when something raises a flag, and it could be something coming out of Luxembourg, or it could be something coming out of another country or a particular area, it's when the flag is raised that we bring to bear all of the intelligence from different departments and agencies, and CRA would be one of those should something of interest pop up from that part of the world. So that's how I would answer.
Donc, merci.
Thank you. This is very relevant information. Is the Act strong enough to protect us against investments from tax havens?
Madam Chair, I would just simply say that the law encompasses national security review process and obviously a net benefit review. Of course, it's one statute. There are many statutes as well as the Income Tax Act, which of course is directly aimed at the question of collecting the revenues that are due and payable to the government of Canada, and any measures taken to contravene that is a matter under another law. So I guess that would be probably the most straightforward answer to the question of the member.
Thank you very much. And that is a little over time, but I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to answer. And we'll now go to MP Massey. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I put this question out. I think Mr. Davies, you might be the best to respond, but and anybody else can answer too, is under the current laws that we have now, if a foreign investor comes in, buys a company, they have a footprint here, but later on, they are then actually taken over elsewhere, their operations by, China or state-owned operation or some other type of an equity firm or something else. Is there ever a review done on that? Because the ownership changes in our country by de facto of the ownership of that company being bought internationally. And do the current powers that we have under ISED, CSIS, or public safety, or even the minister, can they warrant a divestment to protect Canadians? So can we issue an order of divestment?
Madam Chair, the question is if there was to be a subsequent takeover in another country that could affect the Canadian business that's been part of a foreign held enterprise. The question is that investment something that can be reviewed under the national security provisions of the Investment Canada Act? I mean, there is no simple answer, of course, in this each of these.
I just want to know if we can do it. So there is a simple answer. It's whether we can or we can't do it. Can we order divestment?
So the question would be, can we order a review, and whether is it lawful to have a review of that investment? And then in case where there can be an order for review, obviously divestiture could be an outcome of such a review. So there'd be a question at the beginning as to whether there's jurisdiction in the Act. And you'd have to look at the facts. And I would say, and I'm not trying to evade it, I think it's just a question legally. And in fact, there'd be members of the bar that will be arguing this question as to whether an investment has occurred. But if there's a Canadian business that the control is taken over, that's a control change. And if it's a foreign controller, then that could well be something that we could review under the Act. So I could go that far, sir.
So we can order a divestment at the end of the day. That is a possibility under our current laws.
Madam Chair, it could be an outcome, but again, I would say that the fact circumstance from a point of view of the law would have to take into account. But the Canadian business being bought is something that could well be under the scope of the Act for certain.
Thank you, and I know my time's up. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses.
Thank you very much. And with that, ends our first panel. On behalf of the Indu Committee, I want to thank our three witnesses today. It is Public Service Week, and I want to thank you again for joining us, for your excellent testimony, and for helping us in this study. And with that, we will suspend for 5 minutes so that we can switch over for the next panel, and that will be starting momentarily. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It was his birthday last time we met. Happy birthday, Nathaniel.
You leave the last committee very fast, so we didn't have the occasion to wish you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Is he legal drinking age now?
Just legal smoking age.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we are going to unsuspend.
You've been at for a long time, haven't you?
I'm sorry,
Okay,
this
so we
is
will
one
now.
of the interpreters speaking.
Yes.
I couldn't catch their name, but the person who spoke 2 people ago, their sound was not coming from their mic. It was muffled.
Okay.
Mr.
The
Blain.
last, Mr. Blain. Okay, one moment.
C'est moi, Madame la Présidente. J'étais dans la mauvaise langue puisque j'ai parlé en anglais.
I was the wrong language. I spoke English, and no, my microphone had not been activated. It was my computer sound. I'm sorry, but my intention was noble. Thank you.
And again, we will unsuspend, and I'm going to yield the floor to MP Erskine Smith. Go ahead, MP Erskine Smith.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Consistent with the notice of motion I provided the committee on Monday, I move that our committee invite senior executives from Loblaw, Empire, and Metro to testify to our committee and explain their decision to cancel on the same day pandemic pay for essential workers in the middle of the pandemic, and explain to this committee and the Canadian public how that decision was consistent and is consistent with competition laws.
Thank you very much, MP Erskine Smith. The motion is in order, and with that, I open the floor for debate. Is there any debate on the motion?
Yes, Madam Chair. I would like to add witnesses to that being the of those operations, their organized labor, to be able to present as well in front of committee, so that we would not just have them, but we would also have the workers represented through their organized labor, Unifor, and others. There's just a few. If that would be, hopefully it's a friendly amendment, and support the motion, and thank the member for bringing it forward.
Okay, so now we have a friendly amendment on the floor. Is any debate on the friendly amendment?
Madam Chair, perhaps for simplicity, we could simply say, and other witnesses, and Monday is an in-camera meeting to discuss committee business, and we could discuss what those other witnesses might be, and we could flesh out a list, but I'd be perfectly comfortable. I think we should have representatives from workers attend. I think it's worthwhile discussing this in camera as to which one of those witnesses should attend and speak on behalf of workers at our committee.
Sure, that's very good.
Thank you very much. Is there any further debate on the amendment? I'm going to turn it over to the clerk to take the recorded vote for the amendment.
Point of order, Madam Chair. If there's unanimous consent, we can just deem the amendment and the motion adopted so that we can get on with the study that we're scheduled to do today. We would be comfortable with proceeding in that fashion.
My apologies. We cannot have unanimous consent in these virtual meetings. We must have a recorded vote. So unfortunately, we do have to go through the recorded vote, and I will turn it to the clerk. Thank you.
So the question is on the amendment of Mr. Massé to add and other witnesses to the motion. Mr. Erskine Smith.
Yes.
Ms. Lambropoulos.
Yes.
Mr. Jahouri.
In support.
Mr. Assassi.
Apologies, yes.
Mr. Longfield.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta.
Yes.
Ms. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Patzer.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
Oui.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's 11 for 0 against.
I declare the motion carried. We will With respect to the original motion, I believe we have to do a recorded vote for the original motion, now amended. So with that, I'll turn it again to the clerk.
All right, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Yes.
Ms. Lambropoulos.
Yes.
Mr. Jahari.
Support.
Mr. Assassi.
Yes.
Mr. Longfield.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta.
Yes.
Ms. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Patzer.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
Oui.
Mr. Lemire, yes.
Massé. Mr. Massé.
We.
Again, 11-4, 0 against.
I declare the motion carried. And with that, we will now move to our witnesses. Thank you very much for your patience. As we are running a little delayed on time, I'm going to give the quick heads up for the witnesses. Again, reminder, please make sure that your interpretation is on the correct channel for which the language that you will be speaking. When you see this yellow card, that means you have 30 seconds remaining in your intervention. The red card means there is no more time in your intervention. Each witness group will be given 5 minutes to present, after which we will go through rounds of questions. With that, I'm going to introduce the witnesses as I introduce you to speak so that we can save some time. And we will start with Mr. Holden. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and honorable committee members, for this opportunity to speak to you today. The China Institute, which I had after I left government, is the only think tank in Canada focused solely on China. Others cover all of Asia or other issues. We cover economy, social issues, political issues, bilateral relations. Frustrated when I went to the China Institute as its first director about the lack of good data on foreign and Chinese investment in Canada, we created, at considerable expense of our own, a comprehensive database. It tracks right back to the parent Chinese company, be it in Hong Kong or on the mainland. For example, and there are flaws with both, they have their own utilities, but Statistics Canada counts less than $20 billion Canadian of of Chinese investment. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce is similarly flawed. We have collated over $93 billion Canadian of Chinese investment in this country. We sell a subscription. I'm not here to advertise it, but the Library of Parliament, Public Safety Canada, GAC, ISED, Natural Resources Canada, the U.S. Embassy, USTR. We have many subscribers also from law firms and private business. We use, it's actually very smart PhD students, largely using a range of logarithms and databases in Canada, in Europe, in the United States, and in China. We pull together all of this information. We went back as far as 1993, when Chinese investment was almost non-existent. The big acceleration took place in this century, in that range of 2003, 2004, when China began to make $1 billion, $2, $3 billion investments, largely in the energy sector, but also in mines. And then, of course, the blockbuster deal of 2013 of Nexen by Sihanouk, and that was at the time the largest Chinese investment ever abroad. There have been much larger ones since. Chinese investment peaked in that year, reaching in that year $21 billion of investment. It has dropped in 2018 and 2019 to between $2 to $4 billion. And we expect this decrease to continue in 2020 due to three reasons: global economic recession, the bilateral difficulties in the Canada-China relationship, and also China's own stricter rules about who all can take money out and buy what. For example, Anbang has been told, don't be buying retirement homes, stick to your core business, which is insurance. From my perspective, maximum market intervention is not a good thing. Foreign investment has for centuries, quite literally, helped this country develop as it has in the United States. Traditionally, that capital has come from Europe and the United States. But as the center of gravity moves towards Asia, it has changed. And it is important, particularly in capital-intensive resource industries. We've got lots of them. They do need capital. There also, foreign investment can bring much-needed innovation, and it also can bring inclusion in supply chains. But there's always risk involved. In China, and I can be frank, I'm no longer in government, state enterprises are not independent actors. Even private firms can be state controlled. But even not all SOEs are created equal. There's over 300,000 of them. Some might be state enterprise focused on food production in a small municipality in China, low risk. I'm more nervous, quite frankly, about a private Chinese company that's buying for $20 million a high-tech firm where the IP can either be carried away in a briefcase or go down a fiber optic cable. I'm more nervous about that than I am a $100 million investment in a coal mine. Everything's up and visible on the surface. China is taking the product. Parliament is supreme. In extremis, they can stop that exit. IP, once it's gone, it's gone. And that to me is the risk. To me, simply look at SOEs versus private companies. You need a more sophisticated analysis than just that, which isn't to say that SOEs can't perform badly. In Africa, where I have some experience of looking at Chinese investment, sometimes the SOEs have better practices, more environmentally sustainable, better labor practices than some of the pirate firms, which behave very badly indeed. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Greenfield investment is generally better in my view. I know of a wire rope manufacturer in a very high percentage African-American community in the American South, bankrupt firm. China came in, bought the firm, rehabilitated with a lot of money of their own. The mayor of that town is very happy and unemployment has gone down. Similarly, I'd argue in a Canadian example, Feihe International put $225 million into a greenfield investment to produce infant formula. That's a company that started off as SOE and then was privatized. It's not easy, even when you look hard, to tell sometimes what is an SOE and what isn't.
Unfortunately, Mr. Holden, that's your 5 minutes, so I'll have to stop you there. My apologies.
Absolutely. No, I don't apologize. Thank you.
Our next witness, I'm inviting Mr. Kingston from the Business Council of Canada. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. Very much appreciate your invite to take part in these consultations on the Investment Canada Act, ICA. The Business Council of Canada represents CEOs of 160 leading Canadian companies, and we're represented across the country in every sector and region. Our members employ around 1.7 million Canadians and account for about half the value of the TSX. So first, I would just like to begin by underlining the critical importance of foreign investment to the Canadian economy. Prior to COVID-19 and the associated economic downturn, advanced countries around the world were already experiencing slow growth prospects, largely driven by demographic forces, weak productivity growth. In addition to those challenges, though, Canada faced heightened trade uncertainty, ongoing tensions with China, crippling rail blockades, and a deteriorating investment climate due to regulatory uncertainty. So the already weak outlook for the economy pre-pandemic has now reached previously unthinkable lows. According to the PBO's analysis released just today, the economy is expected to shrink by 6.8% this year, and that is the weakest on record since the series began in 1961. So as we start to think about the economic recovery, trade and investment absolutely have to play a central role. We are a trading nation. We depend on open access to the world. And foreign investment not only produces jobs, it enables technology adoption, provokes new management techniques, and it creates market access opportunities. So we have a clear interest in creating stability, transparency, predictability, non-discrimination, and protection for Canadian companies that invest abroad, but also for foreign investors wishing to invest in Canada. So we need to ensure that any changes to the rules governing investment in Canada are as consistent and stable as possible. We absolutely cannot afford as a country to be perceived as a difficult place to invest. Unfortunately, I believe that Canada could do better when it comes to attracting investment. Global FDI stocks have increased dramatically over the past 25 years, but Canada's share of global investment has actually been on the decline. Looking at the 2018 data, our share of total world inward investment stocks fell to 2.8%. That's the lowest level in about 20 years. Meanwhile, countries with more competitive business environments have witnessed an increasing share of global inward investment stocks. We must do better. So now turning to the ICA specifically, we support the government's recent policy statement of April 18th, enhancing scrutiny given the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in. The pandemic and the associated economic fallout could create opportunities for acquisitions by companies that are motivated by non-commercial factors, and that could put Canadian interests at risk. However, because we depend on trade and investment, we believe the government should be very careful not to discourage commercially motivated foreign investment activity. And given that markets have rebounded somewhat since the depths of the crisis, the opportunity for predatory acquisitions by SOEs, for example, is diminishing. So we think these measures should be temporary in nature. And just finally, on the question of strategic industries and the ICA, the legislation clearly provides provisions to protect Canadian national security and absolutely must continue to do so. But I do think what requires a little bit more thinking is identifying exactly what industries should be considered strategic and making sure that we have the economic framework in place to support those sectors. Just for example, I think what we've witnessed throughout this pandemic is the importance of a strong...
My apologies, Mr. Kingston. Is it possible for you to just move your mic a little bit away from your mouth? It's a little too close.
How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Better?
Yep.
Yeah, one of the things that we've witnessed through the pandemic is the importance of a strong manufacturing base, and that companies like CAE, General Motors, Linamar, these are companies that pivoted very quickly to produce critical equipment used in the fight against COVID-19. So as businesses re-examine their supply chains with an emphasis on resiliency and insulating themselves from future disruptions, I think we really have an opportunity here to make sure that Canada puts in place the framework to help these companies grow here, to attract new investment into Canada in those critical sectors. So, that could be done through improving the regulatory environment, addressing the tax system. Those measures would help make Canada more attractive and ensure that we have that strong base to protect us in the future. So happy to expand on that, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Timing. Thank you so much. I will now introduce the Canadian Bar Association. With us today, we have Debbie Salzberger, Michael Kilby, and Marc-André O'Rourke. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll just set the stage here. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am a staff lawyer with the Canadian Bar Association, and we're very pleased to be part of your study. Just switch here. L'ABC est une association.
We are a national association made up of about some 36,000 attorneys across the country. Our main aims are to improve law and the administration of justice, and that's why we've come before you today for the competition section.
Our written brief was prepared by the competition law section of the CBA, namely experts from the Foreign Investment Review Committee. And with me today are Debbie Salzberger and Michael Kilby, Chair and Vice Chair of that committee. I now turn it over to Michael and Debbie to address the main points of our submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc-André, and thank you to the committee and to the Chair. On behalf of the Canadian Bar Association Foreign Investment Review Committee, we offer two primary conclusions in respect of the reform proposals put forward in the context of the current pandemic. I will speak to the first conclusion relating to national security reviews, and my colleague Michael Kilby will speak to the second conclusion, which relates to national benefit reviews. Our first conclusion is that the government has no practical need to adjust the ICA's national security review regime in response to the COVID-19 crisis, given the tremendous powers already available to the government under that regime and the April 18th, 2020 policy statement articulating its intention to utilize its existing powers to more closely scrutinize certain investments under the ICA. The ICA authorizes the government to review any foreign investment by a non-Canadian involving a Canadian business on national security grounds, where the government believes that an investment may be injurious to national security. The national security provisions of the ICA do not specify threshold requirements based on the size of the target or the transaction, nor the extent of the interest being acquired by the foreign investor, nor is the scope of activities that may implicate national security defined. This means that the ICA's national security provisions apply to an extremely broad array of investments, including minority investments, across a wide variety of industries at the government's discretion. The April 18th policy statement amplifies the existing discretion and the latitude available to the government to assess transactions that may be injurious to Canada's national security, and explicitly includes opportunistic investments, investments in public health-related businesses, investments in businesses that supply critical goods or services, none of which is defined, and investments by state-owned enterprises or private investors influenced by state-owned enterprises. Under the current legislation, the government can issue a notice initiating a national security review process at any time from when it becomes aware of an investment until 45 days after receipt of the investor's filing under the Investment Canada Act, or 45 days after it learns of the investment if no filing is required under the legislation. In sum, the current legislation provides the government and its intelligence partners a significant amount of time to determine whether the investment raises potential concerns, and, in such cases, has broad discretion to extend its review and ultimately mitigate any identified risk or block the investment altogether. The April 18th policy statement articulates the government's intention to utilize these tools fully in the COVID-19 environment. For these reasons, there is no practical need for any immediate adjustments to the ICA in response to the potential threats arising out of the current environment. I will now just turn it over to Mike to talk about our conclusion with respect to net benefit reviews.
Thanks, Debbie. I'll be very brief. Our second conclusion is that the government's ability to adjust the ICA net benefit thresholds in response to the crisis may be significantly limited by Canada's international trade obligations. And in any event, any such adjustment may result in an unintended chilling of desirable foreign investment in Canada. I see I've just got a minute or so, so I'll be very quick. The net benefit thresholds are set out in our submission. You're probably also aware of them from other testimony provided. They've been increased substantially since 2015. This has been a policy choice of successive governments. The very high nature of the thresholds means that very few transactions are subject to net benefit review. Approximately 9 were subject to review last year. I see I've got a red card, so I think I'll stop there. I want to respect the time.
Thank you so much. Again, a reminder, this means 30 seconds remaining. This means time is up. Je vais inviter de Équiterre.
Mr. Marc-André Viau from Équiterre. You're the next witness. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the Standing Committee of Industry, Science and Technology. Thank you. I'm Marc-André Viau. I'm the Director of Government Relations at Équiterre. I'm going to share my time with Mrs. Berman from Stand Earth. We're here today to speak to foreign direct investment. Our brief is the results of a study done by my colleague, and Équiterre was associated with this on foreign ownership of tar sands. And so we realized that 70% of the oil sands are foreign owned. So we believe it's valid to question Mr. Viau.
I'm wondering whether it's really a Canadian resource. Could you please slow down slightly?
That's very fast for the interpreters. Could you please slow down? Thank you. If profits are being pocketed by foreign investors, we can ask ourselves the question, who is benefiting from this development? As Canadians, are Canadians stuck with the cleanup bill? My colleague will deal with this in a few moments. Now, with regards to the motion passed and the specific elements of the study, our report offers elements of response as to what strategic Canadian industries have depreciated due to COVID-19. As you will see, we see that the depreciation of businesses operating in the oil sands precedes the pandemic, and we invite the members of the committee to think of the reasons why, or to look at the reasons why. If this phenomenon predates the pandemic and that the pandemic is accelerating depreciation, members of the committee should look at a second element of a motion if Canada should impose a moratorium, a temporary moratorium on acquisitions by state-owned companies from authoritarian regimes. We invite the committee to explain why such a moratorium is more pertinent now than it was in 2012 when the government approved the purchasing of Nexen by CNOOC. The question should be asked if the nature of the political regime that the investment it's important and might be correlated with depreciation. Also, with regards to the assessment thresholds for the CIA, we are favorable to reviewing net benefit criteria. We invite the MPs to look at Section 20E that has to do with the compatibility of investment with national policies with regards to the industrial, economic, and cultural sectors. Industrial and economic policies and cultural policies are increasingly linked to environmental policies. Perhaps we should introduce the concept of an environmental compatibility to Section 20 so that we would be able to speak about a true net benefit for Canada. I will give the floor to my colleague, Zipporah Berman.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here today. I've been asked to speak briefly on the results of our investigative study of ownership and financial benefits from the oil sands. A quick word on methodology. This report is based on data from Statistics Canada, the oil company's annual and quarterly reports, and data obtained from the Bloomberg terminal. The global COVID-19 pandemic has devastated the global economy and plunged the price of oil to record lows. And a bit of context of why we did this particular research is that even before the world was turned upside down by the first global pandemic in a century, as my colleague noted, the oil and gas industry in Canada, despite rising production levels, was cutting jobs, paying less in royalties, while demanding higher and higher subsidies. To be specific, despite increasing oil sands production, the number of jobs created by the oil and gas sector has continued to decline. Since 2014, the industry has shed 53,000 jobs. In addition, reclamation of the oil sands, conventional oil and gas wells, and pipelines in Alberta is now estimated to cost at least $260 billion in liabilities. There is increasing concern that taxpayers, not polluters, will be left holding the bill for the cleanup of this massive toxic liability. Finally, in addition, using WTO definitions, IASD studies are showing us that the federal government is subsidizing the industry billions of dollars to producers, not consumers, providing disproportionate advantage to fossil fuel producers over renewable energy. For many years, industry lobbyists and spokespeople have argued that increased support and greater subsidies were fair because we all benefit from the oil and gas industry. And while Canada has enjoyed many benefits of the oil and gas industry, this investigation reveals that the majority of profits from the industry are leaving the country. We now know that most oil sands production is not owned by Canadians. 10 of the 14 publicly traded companies invested in the oil sands are headquartered in Canada, but only 2 of those are majority owned by Canadians.
Unfortunately, Madame Berman, that is the 5 minutes. I believe you were sharing with Mr. View.
Do I have 30 seconds just to summarize the findings?
Absolutely.
I'll just go right to the summary then. So we found that 70% of oil sands production is owned by foreign companies. Foreign-controlled operational profit in the oil and gas sector has doubled between 2012 and 2016. That's 3.5 times the economy-wide average. And even for the big 5 oil sands companies, through the first 3 quarters of 2019, their profit rate was 14.2%, almost double the Canadian industry average. They're doing well. They're making record profits. The majority of these profits are leaving the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt. Mr. Peter Glossop, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and honorable members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. My comments are personal and do not necessarily reflect the views of my firm or clients. I've been advising clients on the Investment Canada Act for over 30 years. During that time, I've seen the structure of the Act evolve. In my early years of practice, the review thresholds were extremely low, Too many foreign investments were reviewed. The Act didn't address state-owned investors or national security concerns. In contrast, today the Act permits review only of significant investments and of all investments that could injure national security. Because of COVID-19, administration of the Act needs some temporary fine-tuning, but no significant changes. I support careful scrutiny of state-owned investment and the application of national security considerations to all investments, as set out in the Ministerial Policy Statement of April 18. I do not support lower review thresholds or a moratorium on state-owned investments from authoritarian countries along the lines of the June 1st motion. Lowering the thresholds runs counter to the trend in Canada's trade agreements for the last 30 years. If we adopt this change, Canada will send a strong signal it is not open to foreign investment. It would reduce the options for Canadian business owners at a time of great financial distress. And it would call into question Canada's adherence to its international obligations. Equally concerning is the proposed moratorium on acquisition by state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, from authoritarian countries. How would authoritarian be defined? Not all SOEs are just government proxies. Some SOEs are legitimate investors with corporate governance and commercial orientation. Some SOEs are listed on a stock exchange and are accountable to their public shareholders. The Act already contains tools to carefully assess SOE investments on a case-by-case basis. All SOE investments are subject to review at a much lower threshold based on book value. More of them tend to be captured relative to private sector investments. The definition of SOE captures a wide range of state-owned and state-influenced investors, and the minister has power to determine who is an SOE and whether an acquisition of control by an SOE has occurred. In a reviewable investment, an SOE must satisfy the normal net benefit to Canada criteria. The SOE investor also must satisfy additional criteria concerning good corporate governance and adherence to free market principles. Problematic SOE investment from authoritarian countries can also be reviewed for national security reasons. Investments of any size can be reviewed on these grounds. The timelines in the Act allow for a lengthy, careful review for national security. If enacted, Bill C-17 would enable the minister to extend these timelines further. Security review applies even when the investor does not acquire a complete Canadian business. And there are guidelines that list a full range of factors to be considered in the assessment. Using these powers, the government can block an investment, order a divestiture, or allow it to proceed unconditionally. In conclusion, the review thresholds for private sector and SOE investments are set at appropriate levels. The existing review process for SOE investments is sufficiently thorough, and there is a robust national security review process. Thank you for your time. I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glossop. And I now turn to Michelle Travis from Unite Here Canada. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Madame Travis, you're still on mute.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Travis, and I am the Research Director for Unite Here Local 40, which represents hospitality workers across BC and affiliated with our international union, which represents workers across Canada and the US. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about the ICA. In the context of COVID, the committee is studying the adequacy of the current ICA valuation thresholds and whether to place a temporary moratorium on certain state-owned enterprises. In April, the minister announced that certain foreign direct investments in Canadian
which means that
businesses
right now,
will
with the
receive
present
enhanced
funding
scrutiny.
levels for our
These measures will
intelligence
be in place
agencies,
until the economy
from your
recovers from the
perspective, the
pandemic.
government
We
is
think enhanced
forced to
scrutiny
make
is needed.
choices about
However,
we're going to
the real
look into
concern
this
to us is the
aspect
broader
and not
ICA
as much
review
into this
process.
aspect,
There should be
even
greater
if
scrutiny of all
we
deals
can't
reviewed by
necessarily
Ottawa,
know if
and
there's
that
some
should not
possible
stop
risk.
once we are on the other side of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And
The
even within those
valuation
agencies,
threshold
from
for
my experience in
non-state-owned
working with
enterprises
them
jumped
when I was in
significantly to $1
government,
billion
even
in
subsequently,
2017
there's not
and is
always
now
enough
adjusted
capacity.
annually.
You don't make a
That was a
China
huge
expert
increase,
overnight.
and the higher threshold
language
suggests
skills,
that fewer
cultural
transactions involving foreign direct
understanding China,
investment will be reviewed
long
for their impact on
postings,
Canadians.
build up the skill set.
While a
give
temporary
them promotion
moratorium may be
promotional
worthy of
avenues,
consideration
don't
for
move
state-owned
people around on the
enterprises of
chessboard,
authoritarian countries,
because
we
we're
also
never going to
ask,
be
will this
equal to
apply
the
to
U.S.
companies that are not
I've
officially
met
state-owned but may
with
have
the
deep ties
CFIUS
with
group
authoritarian
and
governments.
lectured to them in the United
We really
States.
want to urge the
They've got much
committee to
more
focus more
capacity.
broadly on the
Unfortunately,
rigor of
access
the
to that.
ICA review
But I'd
process
say
itself.
identify
We
risk
ask the committee to
and go
consider
for
these
that,
questions.
rather
How
than a
rigorously
shotgun
does the
approach.
government
If the
assess
word
the
China
net economic
appears, it
benefit
may
of
be
certain
risky, it may not be
transactions, and
risky.
how can the
And that's a
review be
key
made more
determination to
transparent?
Yeah, so that
What
sounds
due
like we
diligence
need to have the
review is conducted
capacity
on
and
the
we need to
ultimate
have the
beneficial
willingness to
owners
conduct,
seeking to invest in Canadian businesses?
conduct these reviews.
What heightened
I
privacy
wonder
protocols are
what you
foreign
think
buyers
about how
expected to
political
adopt when
factors
undergoing
could
ICA
influence the
review?
government's willingness to
What would
conduct
trigger a new
national
security
security
review for
reviews in certain
transactions already
situations and the
approved
risks
under the
around that.
ICA?
We've seen
And what
cases
recourse
of
is there to publicly
Chinese state
review the undertakings
retaliation
and commitments made by
aimed at
foreign
defending the
investors?
particular
The
interests
average
of
Canadian hotel worker
even
may
not
appear to be
officially
far removed
state-owned
from
but
these
state-affiliated
Yet some of
companies
them work
that
for
are
companies
sort of
acquired by
darlings
opaque
of
corporate
the
entities in
regime.
transactions
So,
approved under the ICA.
what are the risks? Some of the witnesses are
2016,
saying
BC's public pension fund,
just
BCI, sold its hotel
the
management
government has
company,
the power to do
Silverbirch,
national
and a
security
portfolio of 26
reviews already.
hotels
What's
to
the
lay down
problem?
investment
But if
for
we're hearing
over
there's
$1 billion.
limited resource
The
capacity, but
ultimate
also there's
ownership of
political
Leadon remains
factors,
opaque. The
might
Vancouver
that
Sun
pose some
tried to learn
problems in
more
terms of the
about Leadon
government's
at the time
will
and
or
found
ability
only
to
a
do these
downtown
reviews when
Vancouver-based
necessary?
law firm's mailing address, and one director
Well, they
who listed his
shouldn't be,
address in
and there shouldn't be
New
those
York. The Hong Kong
hesitations.
connection was not
They ought
obvious.
to, in
That
my
same
view,
year, in
just
2016,
go
Beijing,
to
based on
go to the heart of the
Hong
matter,
Kong, initiated
irrespective
negotiations to
of who might be
acquire
annoyed. However,
Invest Real Estate
if you're going to
Investment
write
Trust,
into the
one of Canada's
ICA,
largest hotel
naming
owners, but
companies,
backed out suddenly.
put
The
on your
Financial
seatbelt
Post
because there'll
reported
be a
that
strong
Anbang did not
reaction.
want to be named
To
as the
me,
buyer, and when that was met with
using language
objections,
such
their
as state-owned
representative,
enterprise,
Lydia Chen, said she
authoritarian
was representing a
regimes,
new
fine.
pool of capital
China
based
figures
on
that
Hong
out
Kong called Blue
just like
Sky,
that. They know what's
which
aimed at them
acquired
because they're
Invest
the
for over
only
$2 billion
large
under the ICA
authoritarian
review
country which is
process.
putting a mountain of
Anbang was
investment, or a large
reportedly
amount of
also under
investment in Canada.
examination by
They'll figure
China's
that out.
insurance
The instant you
regulator at
name
the
them,
time.
you
They
make a
have
lot of
denied
public
in
statements, you're
connection
going to
with Blue
worsen it,
Sky,
not
but
just for our
Anbang's
two
former
Michaels,
representative, Ms.
but
Chen, is
that
now
broad
the CEO of
political
Blue Sky and
relationship we
Invest.
do, like
And
it or
their
not, we
ultimate
do need to maintain.
beneficial ownership is unclear.
Thank you
Records
very
from Hong
much.
Kong's corporate
We'll now
registry
move
trace
to
Blue
MP
Sky to a shell
Assassi. You
company
have
in
the
British
floor
Virgin
for 6
Islands.
minutes.
Questions about Blue Sky's ownership.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to all the witnesses who have kindly appeared before our committee today. Now, for the first question, I'd like to go to Ms. Salzberger.
And others in Alberta and Quebec.
Ms. Salzberger, I've had the opportunity to review the submission that you made. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive, and it's answered some questions and some concerns that I had. You referred to the national security guidelines under the ICA, which were published in 2016. And as you indicate in your submission, it is a very, very broad provision. There are no monetary thresholds, and it's quite obvious that the 2016 statement is concerned about the transfer of sensitive technology. It discusses critical infrastructure, critical goods and services. How significant is the 2016 notice that was provided by Industry
Canada? We wonder what criteria was used to determine the net benefit of these transactions. Then there's the larger political context to consider.
The guidelines, you mean?
Yes.
Prior to our heightened tensions
you've stated
with China,
it's
there were
very
already
broad.
concerns about China's efforts to
encompasses and covers any type of transaction that would be of concern. So would you delve into this one more time just to unpack it for us and tell us how it would cover everything?
Sure. Well, I guess there's two ways to answer that. Thank you for your question. One way is the fact that it is undefined.
In conclusion,
by
the point of the ICA
definition,
review process
for
is to ensure
non-definition
foreign
means that
investments
there is
benefit all
very broad
Canadians.
discretion
We think a more
within
rigorous
the
and
Act to
transparent
cover
benefit analysis and security
evolving
review should
threats,
demand more
current
of foreign
threats,
investors, regardless of their
and
country
so
of
on
origin.
across a variety of industries, including technology,
Thank you very
IT,
much,
and so
Ms.
on.
Travis.
That's been a
We'll now
topic
go
of
to our round
discussion,
of
I think, of
questions.
this
Our first round
committee
of questions goes to
over the last
MP
few days.
Genuith. You have 6 minutes.
The Investment Canada
Thank you, Madam
guidelines
Chair, and I'll
also
start
take
with
and make
Professor
reference to
Houlden.
public
You came and
safety,
spoke to the Sherwood Park Rotary
commentary
Club that I
on
was a
the
part
types
of
of
8
issues
or
that
9
might
years
be
ago. You
covered
probably
or
don't
concerns
remember,
that
but I
might be
want
covered
to thank you
under
for
the
being
national
engaged with
security
our
provisions
community
of
back
the
in my
Investment Canada
constituency.
Act.
I wanted to probe a little
we
bit
have,
some of the distinctions you
for
made,
those
because
that aren't as
I found it
familiar
quite
with the
interesting that
guidelines, there's a
right now the
laundry
Investment
list
Canada
of,
Act looks at dollar
potential
value, and it
effects
looks
of the
generally
investment that are
at state-owned
covered. They
enterprises.
include not only
But you made the
defense-related
point, I think, quite
capabilities,
well that we might
transfer of sensitive
distinguish
technologies and know-how,
between
things that you might expect.
state-owned
But given the
enterprises
April 18th,
that are of a
2020
certain
statement,
scale, and that
we
we
also
also might
understand, and it
want
has been
to be
emphasized,
particularly
that the guidance
cautious
covers
about
things like
private
supply of critical
affiliated,
goods and
private
things,
but state
that are
affiliated
covered under
companies.
government
If you
contracts.
could maybe talk a little bit about
to sum
those
up, I
private
think it's quite
affiliated
broad.
companies
I
in
don't know if that
the
answers your
Chinese
specific
context. We
question.
know that they're
Absolutely.
virtually all private
So now
companies
if
of a
I could
certain
go
scale are
to page
expected to
5
have party
of
committees
your
that are
submission,
central to the
you
decision
state
making
in
of
the
those
submission
companies,
that under the
and that those
national
companies
security
are
review
expected to be
provisions,
gathering
these provisions
IP that is
extend
useful to the
beyond
military, partnering
acquisitions
with
of
the military on an
control,
ongoing basis.
even
So
to
there really isn't the
minority
state-owned
investments.
enterprise
But from a procedural
and the private
standpoint,
sector distinction that we would
is
see in
there
other
a de minimis
economies. Really,
threshold
there's
if someone
sort of a
wants to make a
centralization
portfolio
of power
investment?
and control.
So how does that process
and then
work,
maybe
and
we should
how,
make other
how
kinds
is
of
it flagged
distinctions
for our
around
various
whether
government
IP
agencies?
is involved or not. So if you could speak to
So the Investment
possible
Canada
changes we
process
could make
works
to
in
the
the
Act
context of
that
an
would
acquisition
bring
of
in this
control.
concept of private
And an
affiliated
acquisition of
companies.
control by any foreigner of a Canadian
Thank you.
business
I'll
requires
speak to
the
any community
submission
organization
of a
at any time.
notification
That's
or an
policy, and I'm
application
delighted
for
to have that
review to the
connection.
Investment Review Division.
I think you're quite right. Not
The
all
statement
SOEs
in
are created
respect of
equal.
our
There's
submission speaks
300,000
to
of
the
them.
fact
Some
that the
pose low
national
risk,
security
higher
review
risk. When
provisions
general,
of the
an
Investment
SOE
Canada Act
with a more direct connection
extend beyond
to sensitive
notifiable
sectors
investments,
is more risky.
i.e. beyond
But if you're, let's
acquisitions
say,
of
in the Ministry
control,
of Science and Technology
and could
or the
include
Ministry of
within the
Defense of
jurisdiction
China,
of the government
and
to
you're
review
interested in a
investments that are
potential
minority
dual-use
investments,
technology,
which otherwise are
you
not
may well
notifiable.
want to approach
I
that
think your question is
acquisition through a private
potentially
company.
how would those
And
investments come to the attention
mix,
of the
if you look at
government?
our data set,
Exactly.
we
Yes.
divide SOEs and
There are various ways. I
private
mean, it's
enterprise
possible
and
that they
investment
may
in
be
Canada.
through
And one of my
public
researchers came
disclosure,
here,
but as well, I think
last
you
year
heard
and said,
earlier
well, look,
from
there's
your
about
colleague, our
5%
colleagues,
we can't
our
even
friends at
figure it out
CSIS and
because there
Public
are
Safety, and
looks like historical
our understanding
dependencies,
is
some
that
connections
there
there.
are
And so you
avenues
just
through
put it
which
in one
there
other
is
or divide it.
monitoring, but that is
No.
outside of the
Leave
scope
it as
of
an
the Investment
unknown
Canada
because
Act.
it makes the point that
Out of the
you can't
scope,
always
sorry, in the
determine,
sense
even
of
if it is an SOE
non-notifiability,
or it's
but not out of the
So I
scope
would
in the
say
sense of
focus on
jurisdiction.
not the big
Thank you.
lumbering
Now, if I could go to Mr.
coal miner,
Glossop. Mr.
where we know
Glossop,
where
you
the
come at
product's
this
going,
with
probably
many,
to China.
many
They may need,
decades
the
of
firm may need a
experience.
market.
One of the
province may need a
concerns
market.
that's been
You
raised
look at
today
the
is
high-tech, and
how
we don't have enough of
ownership can be
innovative
opaque
companies.
if there are
That's
investments.
where I would focus
So
maximum
how
effort.
is beneficial
Public safety
ownership
and the
determined, and
intelligence
how
capacity of this country is not
robust is the
unlimited.
system we currently have in
And,
place?
whether
Thank
they
you for your
need to,
question.
There's one company
I
in Edmonton,
think
for
that
example, that produces
the
pot stickers,
system does
and
permit
ships them to Japan,
the
yes,
government to unpack
Canada.
ownership
That's not
quite
the
well.
focus. It is a state
There
enterprise.
are
It's harmless,
extensive
in my view.
provisions
Go
around
for where the risk
determining
is greatest,
ultimate
and that's
control of
innovation,
the investor.
IP threat,
And so
focus on
when
that to to the
an
degree
investor
necessary.
is
And,
submitting a
that to me is even
notification
more
or an
important than the
application for review,
threshold issue.
that
Focusing on
information
the
must
best
be
targets.
submitted.
Okay, I'm going to try to get a couple more questions into you here quickly.
The
It's
directors of
very
the
interesting what you just
investor,
said, that intelligence capacity is
highest
limited,
paid
which means that
officers,
right now with the present
and
funding
the
levels for our intelligence
nature of any
agencies,
foreign
from
state
your perspective, the
ownership
government
in that investor.
is forced to make choices about, we're going to look
That's my
into this aspect and not as much into this aspect,
Thank you very
even
much.
if we can't necessarily know if there's some possible
Our
risk.
next question goes to
And even within those
MP
agencies, from my experience in
Tremblay. You have
working
6
with them
minutes here.
when I was in
Hello,
government and
thank
even
you,
subsequently,
Chair. My
there's not
question
always
is
enough
for
capacity.
Mr.
You don't
View.
make a
Thank
China
you so
expert
much for
overnight.
your presentation for
Language
Equiterra.
skills,
You
cultural
have mentioned
understanding,
that in
understanding
your
China,
report,
long
you show
postings, build up the skill set, give them
that
promotional
most of
avenues.
the
Don't move people around on a chessboard.
oil sands
Because we're never going to be
sector
equal
is
to the
owned
U.S.
by foreign owners. I'd like to know the figures and what the trends are, because I do remember reading in 2016 a Daniel Breton text. He was the Minister of the Environment here in Quebec in 2012,
rather than
which
a shotgun
showed
approach. If the word China appears, it may be risky.
Fewer
it may
and
not
fewer
be risky,
foreign companies were interested.
Yeah, so that sounds like we need to have the capacity and we need to have the willingness to conduct.
Perhaps he was speaking in general and not necessarily about the oil sands.
I wonder what you think about how political factors could influence the government's willingness to conduct national security reviews in certain situations and the risks around that. We've seen cases of Chinese state retaliation aimed at defending the particular interests of even not officially state-owned but state-affiliated companies that are sort of darlings of the regime. So, what are the risks? Some of the witnesses are saying
oil sands sector, which is
the government has the power to do national security reviews already. What's the problem? But if we're hearing there's limited resource capacity, but also there's political factors, might that pose some problems in terms of the government's will or ability to do these reviews when necessary?
Well,
they
sense.
Shouldn't be.
Our study
those hesitations.
There are 70% of the production
go
is controlled by
go to the heart of the matter, irrespective of who might be annoyed. However, if you're going to write into the ICA naming
control
companies,
of operating
put on
costs
your seatbelt because there'll be a strong reaction. To me,
has gone from 31.6% in 2012 to 58.4% in 2016.
China figures that out just like that. They know it's aimed at them because they're the only large authoritarian country which is putting a mountain of investment, a large amount of investment into Canada. They'll figure that out.
Developing situation changes.
But get a lot of public statements. You're going to worsen it, not just for our two Michaels,
minus
that broad political relationship we do,
compared
like it or not,
to
we do need to maintain.
2014 at the height.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
To clean up the orphan wells.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to all the witnesses who have kindly appeared before our committee today. Now, for the first question, I'd like to go to Ms. Salzberger. Ms. Salzberger, I've had the opportunity to review the submission that you made. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive, and it's answered some questions and some concerns that I had. You referred to the national security guidelines under the ICA, which were published in 2016.
Like Statoil,
and as you indicate in your submission, it is a very, very broad provision. There are no monetary thresholds, and it's quite obvious that the 2016 statement is concerned about the transfer of sensitive technology. It discusses critical infrastructure, critical goods and services. But how significant is the 2016 notice that was provided by Industry Canada?
The ownership of the existing companies, the investors in the existing companies.
The guidelines, you mean?
70%.
You stated that it's very broad. It encompasses and covers any type of transaction that would be of concern. So would you delve into this one more time just to unpack it for us and tell us how it would cover everything?
Interests now own more than 52%.
Well, I guess there's two ways to answer that. Thank you for your question. One way is the fact that it is undefined by definition. For non-definition means that there is very broad discretion within the Act to cover evolving threats, current threats, and so on across a variety of industries, including technology, IP, and so on. That's been a topic of discussion, I think, of this committee over the last few days. The Investment Canada guidelines also take and make reference to public safety commentary on the types of issues that might be covered or concerns that might be covered under the national security provisions of the
There is a trend to disengage, but most of the foreign investment stays there.
For those that aren't as familiar with the guidelines, there's a laundry list of potential effects of the investments that are covered. They include not only defense-related capabilities, transfer of sensitive technologies and know-how, things that you might expect, but given the April 18th, 2020 statement,
in these foreign states,
we also understand that it has been emphasized that the guidance covers things like supply of critical goods and things that are covered under government contracts. To sum up, I think it's quite broad. I don't know if that answers your specific question.
Absolutely. So now if I could go to page 5 of your submission, you state in the submission that under the national security review provisions, these provisions extend beyond acquisitions of control, even to minority investments. But from a procedural standpoint,
what we would like to see,
is there a de minimis threshold if someone wants to make a portfolio investment? So how does that process work, and how is it flagged for our various government agencies?
An investment is assessed
so the Investment Canada process works in the context of an acquisition of control. And an acquisition of control by any foreigner of a Canadian business requires the submission of a notification or an application for review to the Investment Review Division.
Surely lead us to think further.
The statement in respect of our submission speaks to the fact that the national security review provisions of the Investment Canada Act extend beyond notifiable investments, i.e.
with
beyond
regards to
acquisitions
Ongbong,
of control,
it really brings
and
to
could include
light
within the jurisdiction of the government to review investments that are minority investments,
people think of
which
foreign
otherwise are
investment
not
into Canada something
I think your
that's
question is
basically
potentially how would those investments come to the attention of the government?
The oil sands or manufacturing.
There are various ways. I mean, it's possible that they may be
some
through
product at the end of the day.
Public disclosure, but as well, I think you heard earlier from your colleagues, our friends at CSIS and Public Safety, and our understanding is that there are avenues through which there is monitoring, but that is outside of the scope of the Investment Canada.
And maybe you can kind of highlight a little bit about
the scope,
the work that's been
in the
going
sense
on
of
there, because this is
non-notifiability, but not
an unknown factor as the problem that came about.
Thank you. Now, if I could go to Mr. Glossop. Mr. Glossop, you come at this with many decades of experience. One of the concerns that's been raised today is how ownership can be opaque if there are investments. So how is beneficial ownership determined, and how robust is the system we currently have in place?
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that the system does permit
we don't represent the workers
government to unpack ownership quite well. There are extensive provisions around determining ultimate control of the investor.
To us is that there
and
were
so
questions
when
raised about
an investor is submitting a notification or an application for review,
and it was surprising
that information must be submitted, including, for example, the directors of the investor, the highest paid officers,
of the company by
and
the
nature of any foreign state
and I
ownership in that
what's
investor.
happened in terms of the conditions at the long-term care homes.
That's my time.
The unions representing those workers have raised issues about staffing problems.
Notre prochain tour est pour le député Savard Tremblay. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Bonjour, merci Madame la Présidente. Ma question ira à Monsieur Giguot. Merci pour votre présentation au nom des critères. Vous avez donc mentionné que votre rapport finalement établissait qu'il y avait une majorité de l'industrie, une part majeure de l'industrie des sables bitumineux qui était sous possession étrangère. Je serais curieux d'avoir un peu les chiffres et la tendance aussi, parce que j'avais lu, je me souviens d'un texte en 2016 de Daniel Breton qui avait été ministre de l'Environnement en 2012 dans le gouvernement du Québec et qui plutôt nous établissait qu'il y avait de moins en moins de compagnies étrangères qui s'intéressaient au secteur pétrolier. Puis là, c'est le secteur pétrolier en général, donc pas seulement bitumineux. Précisons-le, c'est peut-être ça la différence. Et c'est vous l'expert, je vais vous écouter là-dessus après. Mais donc, qui établissait, donc au final, ça faisait en sorte également qu'il y avait de moins en moins de redevances et que la grande part, plutôt grandissante, c'était plutôt les fonds de pension. Autrement dit, qu'on risquait les retraites des Canadiens et des Québécois. D'ailleurs, la Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec s'était jetée là-dedans pendant une certaine période à pieds joints. Autrement dit, qu'on risquait les retraites comme ça pour ce secteur qui est au final tout sauf intéressant sur le long terme. Donc, j'aimerais vous entendre là-dessus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le député, pour votre question. Madame la Présidente, je vais commencer.
You mentioned with regards to the situation, and I'm glad it was the hotel, ownership, because that's also person's personal data, information, a whole series of exposures that are very important. Even when you look at where I'm coming from, the auto sector, one of the biggest things that's changing is not necessarily you see the innovation taking place, but also the data collection of it and the way the vehicle's used. And so can you highlight a little bit about the exposure of people's private data and information? Starwood was one of the ones I was even affected as a customer. But can you detail a little bit about that exposure, because that's pretty serious?
Sure. Yeah, so the Marriott cyber attack was probably one of the biggest cyber attacks in recent memory. I'm sure there'll be a larger one that comes soon, but in terms of the hotel sector, it really does have a reputation for being notoriously sensitive to hacks, cyber attacks. There's hotels have access to large amounts of information. You're going into a hotel, you're using their Wi-Fi system.
You are right in your question in that there has been a major flight of IOCs from the oil sands.
Understand their preferences
and to target over the last 5 years, we've seen about 50,
while hotels have not been considered strategic
from major international
industry,
oil companies,
I would put them in the category sensitive given the amount of information.
Companies like Statoil, Total, etc.
Yeah,
We've also seen major
that's not only just
investment
domestic,
houses
but the hotel chains
insurance houses saying
are
that they will
international.
no longer insure
So
oil sands or related
questions of
activities, and they
security
will no longer
of data
invest
and information
in oil
because you're
sands
not
or
only
related
domestically but
activities
also
because of the
internationally.
high carbon nature.
That's right. The hotel chains cross
our
borders,
oil,
and
some because
the example
of
of Marriott's
relative
in just
to,
about every major country, in just about every country around the globe.
But
and they're not the only
despite
hotel
that foreign
operator
ownership
that you can
being pulling out of the oil sands directly.
Great, thank you. I see the yellow card up, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses.
Investors in the existing companies.
Thank you very much. We now move to
70%. So
we now move to round two, and the first round of questions goes to MP Patzer. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
2% of oil sands production.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start with Professor Holden. You were saying earlier that it's hard to tell what's a state-owned enterprise and what's not before you ran out of time. Would you mind just finishing that point, especially as it relates to authoritarian countries investing in Canada?
Other non-US investors.
Well, the majority of state enterprises we can determine.
What we did is we looked at each company and looked at their percentage that was Canadian
think tank. And the majority of those cases, it can be fish or foul. We sort that out. But there's a minority, about 5% of the Chinese investment in Canada, where, some of the senior executives appear to have come from an SOE. The capital appears to have come from a state bank, maybe from a SOE that existed before. Some SOEs are privatized, but it's not really clear in what way they've changed.
Il y a une petite tendance au désengagement, mais la majorité reste là. Vous aviez évoqué tout à l'heure, je crois que c'était Monsieur Viau, si je ne me trompe pas, la possibilité d'un contrôle, justement, dans ce secteur et dans bien d'autres, un contrôle en fonction du pays de provenance sur certains critères qui pourraient être liés, par exemple, au régime en lui-même. Allez-vous pousser un peu plus cette réflexion sur les critères et surtout comment on pourrait les établir et comment on pourrait avoir une évaluation avant d'autoriser un investissement?
The Canadian Review authorities look at that and determine it's not an SOE. But in reality, it may be. So yes, it would be a small minority, but potentially yes. SOE that was not necessarily even masquerading. I believe in some of these cases, managers have, as happened in the former Soviet Union, have migrated with capital in some cases and then may appear as a private enterprise, or you may have left their former SOE, but somehow they've got funding that came from the SOE, the same people. There would be some cases like that. I'd like to think again, with really capable analysts in our agencies of various sorts, we'd be able to sort that out. We can do so quite well. When we see an investment that's coming in from Chinese dimensions coming in from Barbados,
alors, je vous remercie, Monsieur Viau, merci, Madame Berman également. C'était fort intéressant, puis ça va assurément nous pousser à réfléchir là-dessus dans les prochains temps.
And the Chinese data, they go for the first destination,
Merci beaucoup. Our next round of questions goes to MP Massé. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Where there's tax
my question to Ms. Travis, with regards to Ong Bong,
it's not always nefarious,
it really brings to light
push behind
the real
that screen to find out
results
where it is
of this. I mean, often
originating.
People think of foreign investment
My colleague was asking
Canada
an earlier panel about the difference of process and threshold for a security screening and a security review without really a clear answer. So do you have any insight on how well either of these are working for meaningfully protecting our national security, and could they be improved?
But here, our product is our own citizens and our people.
I spent 32 years in government. I can assure you of that.
At the end of the day,
and in my university, for that matter, that's a given.
But British Columbia had to step in.
Staffing levels are important. I think
and maybe you can kind of highlight a little bit about the work that's been going on there, because this is
expertise.
Not an unknown factor of the problem that came about.
You ask public safety,
series of warning signs along the way.
Chinese speakers,
and lastly, what are your thoughts with regards to divestment
which was hinted at by one of
some of these facilities?
Panelists, I believe, one of the other speakers,
odd
was
that we'd have the Chinese government owning the basically the and controlling at the end of the day the futures of our seniors and the facilities that they operate. They couldn't even do that for the law.
Firms here, when I think of Alcan, which vanished, is now in foreign hands. I think of other examples. I'm not always sure that initial undertakings have enough legs or duration, whether they're being sufficiently
for some time because of their involvement in the hotel industry.
Okay, and we've heard from other witnesses about a variety of indirect methods for foreign influence, and specifically about how the Chinese government has plans for many social and economic targets in different countries.
During the review,
based on your ongoing study, do you think there is or could be Chinese influence among Canada's legal and public policy experts because of their business or other professional connections?
Such a difficult question. I wish you'd pose easier questions. The truth is, yes, China does misbehave, and they do look at targets of influence, and that's the job of our security agencies to detect and deal with that. Quite frankly, I'm of the school that naming and shaming helps. The Americans do a better job. At any given time, there's usually about 30 different cases before the courts in the United States. We often request the person quietly leave, and I'm not sure that I think the public would be painful in the bilateral relationship, but I think it's better sometimes. We've done it on a few occasions where there's actually a court proceeding, or it's clear even if the persons have fled what they had done. The principal target tends to be, and here they need our help, Canadians of Chinese ethnic origin. They are the primary targets. Chinese, for a bunch of historical reasons, are afraid of that group. Over.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
During that,
thank you very much, Madam Chair. Now, my first question is for Ms. Travis. Ms. Travis, as you're well aware, the mandate of our industry committee is to look into the Canada Investment Act and to determine whether it's robust enough. On several occasions today, you've brought up the Marriott cyber attack. You would agree with me that that has nothing to do with the Investment Canada Act. Is that
I think
correct?
it does call into question the nature of the example of how do we make those tools right for rigorous. And I do think it's good that the government wants to heighten scrutiny, particularly.
But cyber attacks happen all the time, and that there's no way that Investment Canada Act has been with those types
you
of
mentioned with regards to the situation. If we're going to talk about the hotel, security and ownership, review because that's also personal data, information, a whole series of exposures that are very important. Even when you look at where I'm coming from, the auto sector, one of the biggest things
you would agree with me that Investment Canada,
you see the innovation taking place, but also the data collection of and the way the vehicles used.
So now, if I could go to Mr. Marc-Andre Villa.
Private data.
Mr. Villa, as you know, on April 18th, Industry Canada actually issued a policy statement. And in that policy statement, it says it acknowledges the fact that some Canadian companies may be distressed, and there may be incidents of predatory investments. As a result of that, on April 18th, Industry Canada announced the government will subject all foreign investments by state-owned investors, regardless of their value, to enhanced security under the Act. Are you in favor of that statement?
You're using their Wi-Fi system. system,
well, I'm not in a
you're using your credit cards. And there's a large amount of information that's collected on customers because you want to understand their preferences and to target certain services to them. So, while hotels have not been considered strategic, a strategic industry, I would put them in the category sensitive, given
but
the
sir, that's not analysis. They're telling Canadians that
and they also,
going forward during this period,
domestic, but the hotel
that every investment by state-owned enterprises will be subject to enhanced scrutiny
of data and
is that a good step in your opinion?
Not only domestically, but also internationally.
That's right. The hotel chains cross borders.
This would be based on information.
The example of Marriott's in just about every major country, in just about every country around the globe. And they're not the only hotel operator that you can find operating cross borders.
As I understand, sir, you said you were in favor of a moratorium on foreign investment by state-owned enterprises.
Thank you very much.
Is that not correct?
We now move to...
No, what I said more specifically
we now move
is
to round 2, and the first round of questions goes to MP Patzer. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
In the scope of our study, to
Thank
assess
you, Madam
the
Chair.
relevance
I'll start with Professor Holden. You were saying earlier that it's hard to tell what's a state-owned enterprise and what's not before you ran out of time. Would you mind just finishing that point, especially as it relates to authoritarian countries investing in Canada?
Factors that,
well, the majority of state enterprises we can determine.
Thank you. Now, if I could go to Professor Holden. Professor Holden, as I understood it, I think you were talking about how the U.S. CFIUS process is more robust than ours. Can you provide us with an example as to why CFIUS would be more robust than the Canada Investment Act?
Come from a state bank. Well, I think it's maybe from because CFIUS has changed dramatically that existed in the last 2 years. Some SOEs are privatized. Security was not really clear. They couldn't even look at any way they changed other than when I spoke to shares. For example, the Congressional Economic and Security Commission, they complained that we've actually decided what we were doing. Now they've come up with a Mark II, which allows them to look at half as the same kind of principles as Australia and Canada, because it makes clear that really fuzziness good for us of some of the data regarding state enterprises.
But I'm just asking from a substantive standpoint, would you agree that Investment Canada Act is just as robust as the CFIUS process or the amended CFIUS process?
Conceivably, I suppose, for that 5%, full capacity is there. Let's imagine that the Canadian review authorities look at that
and you've also stated that, in your opinion,
in reality,
that our bureaucracy doesn't have sufficient resources to screen and look into investments.
Not necessarily
what is that based on?
I believe in some of these cases, my managers have my adult life is almost entirely former Soviet Union. So when I speak about that, I'm thinking migrated of China with capital in some cases, and then may have challenges, cultural challenges, or you may have you can't left their come into an organization, say public safety, they've got funding and understand the nuances and complexities, the same people of how SOEs operate, how the party operates. I'd like to think again, committees and private companies with really capable analysts, cadre agencies, a number of sorts, but I've got able to sort that out. Reasons to we can do so quite well, and we need to build that capacity. When we see starts an investment coming in, unfortunately, you can't take that appears to have Chinese dimensions coming in from Barbados or Cayman Islands. Heavens, no problem.
We're now moving to MP Gray. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
That'd be investing $5 million in Canada. We sort that out. And the Chinese data, they go for the first destination. It's all Hong Kong.
MP Gray, you're still on mute.
Appears to go to Hong Kong, but then it diversifies.
I clicked it. There we go.
Other places,
I wanted to ask some questions today for Mr. Holden. I know that another witness here this afternoon went into detail about the foreign takeover of nursing homes
was asking an
going
earlier
wrong
panel
with
about the difference of process
and which owns
for
Retirement Concepts, a company with private long-term care facilities throughout the country, 20 of which are in British Columbia. And this was approved by the federal government and by Minister Baines himself, who scrutinized it under the Investment Review Division because it exceeded the dollar threshold. And we heard from other witnesses, and we know that as part of the Investment Canada Act, that reviews can occur at discretion of the minister. So considering this and based on your experience, is there a lot of subjectivity around this? And are there some other parameters that we should be considering when we're looking outside of just the dollar value per consideration.
Analysts, I believe, you raised a very speakers was, and I think that follow-up.
Even the Chinese government, quite frankly,
I wonder sometimes if the conditions that are imposed
capital flow
being SOEs investing in things other ones. I'm not just thinking of Chinese.
I would argue
firms here, when I think of Alcan, which vanished.
This is in retrospect.
There's now in four hands. I think of other examples.
Yes,
I'm not always sure that
might have been raised.
Does this have enough legs, duration, and whether experience and the know-how to be looking after aged people?
Okay, and we've heard from other witnesses about a variety of indirect methods for foreign influence, and specifically about how the Chinese government has plans for many social and economic targets in different countries.
That would mean changing.
Based on your ongoing study, do you think there is or could be Chinese influence among Canada's legal and public policy experts because of their business or other professional connections?
Might be done. Such a difficult question. Can this company manage an environmentally delicate space, say in the Arctic? Yes, China does those are the sort of questions, and they do look at targets of influence, and that's the job of our security agencies. Might well be detect and deal with. If you're looking at the full, quite frankly, I'm of the school that naming and shaming helps.
Okay, thank you. And sort of moving forward to that, using that as an example, or perhaps other examples, do you think that there should be some type of standards for these state-owned enterprises that should result in some type of action if there are issues that come out of previous investments from these companies? Is there some type of recourse or some type of action down the road for future investments that you would consider?
I would think that would be reasonable. In other words, you've done afraid of that group, and you want to come back to the well, and we may be concerned that you do badly again. One small point, I think you have to be just as hard on Canadian companies. You get into difficulties then otherwise.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Now, my first question is for
so we don't want to get a situation where we give the Chinese a good excuse
Ms. Travis, as you're well aware,
high standards for us,
the mandate of our industry committee is to look into the Canada.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions for Ms. Travers now from Unite Here. I know that in your testimony and in some of the other questions you went into
you would agree with me that
the issue of with the hotel industry and
it's an example
with a cyber attack and you went into some explanation there. But I'm wondering if from your perspective on with all of your members, how
there's no way that
how this affects them from also from a worker's point of view, but also from a business point of view, and also from a customer's point of view. Knowing that you have a hotel chain that might potentially be owned, from a state-owned enterprise, and if there's a cyber attack, what are the various concerns that you've seen around that?
Should be taken a closer look at. I think it's one of the things
where. But you would agree with me that Investment Canada
people want to be
correct.
It was not about the Marriott. They want to make sure.
Ms. Travis, I'm sorry to
now if I could go to Mr. Marc-Andre.
Sure, can you hear me now?
Mr. Villa, as you know,
I think in terms of,
on April 18th,
the Marriott
Industry Canada
again, I'm just using
actually
this as an example,
issued a policy
was,
statement,
alarming,
and in that policy statement it says it acknowledges the fact that some Canadian companies may be distressed, and there may be incidents of predatory investments. As a result of that, on April 18th, Industry Canada announced the government will subject all foreign investments by state-owned investors, regardless of their value, to enhance security under that. Are you in favor of that statement?
Once an attack happens, people are naturally, concerned about how their information is being used.
And we're dealing with the risk of dispose Industrie Canada pour faire cette analyse-là. Donc, je vais me référer à leur expertise et à leurs compétences.
So I think that's just to say it's always a concern.
But sir, that's not analysis. They're telling Canadians that going forward during this period, that every investment by state-owned enterprises will be subject
and we will now
to
move to MP Longfield.
Scrutiny.
You have the floor.
Is that a
for
good
5
step
minutes.
in your opinion?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and we could do with a few more hours with all these witnesses. Thank you all for coming with all your expertise. I'd like to start off with Mr. Holden and then follow up with a question around trade with Mr.
But as I understand, sir,
Mr. Holden,
as I understand, sir, you said you were in favor of a moratorium
long-term care facility
on foreign investment by state-owned enterprises.
Part of the conditions have to do cross-jurisdictional with the provinces who have full jurisdiction over long-term care and whether it's a viable business and to do an evaluation. We had a testimony earlier in the study that just briefly mentioned cross-jurisdictional matters. Could you maybe expand on that just for 30 seconds or so, please?
Very quickly. There is provision within the Act
simplement sur la nature du régime politique. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres facteurs qui devraient être
Saskatchewan. Thank you.
There's political dimensions in provinces as well. But
thank you. Now, if I could go to Professor Holden. Professor Holden, as I understood it, I think you were talking about how the U.S. CFIUS process is more robust than ours.
Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of that is confidential.
Example as to why CFIUS would be more robust than the Canada Investment Act?
And that is one of the challenges. If they don't see it, they may not believe it happened. CFIUS has changed dramatically, and that is in the last 2 years.
Yes,
it went from the only thing.
And I think we saw that in our first panel too, that a lot of these matters are confidential.
And when I spoke to,
but when,
for example,
with Mr. Glossop, I'm not coming from a legal background. I'm coming more from a
what we were doing.
Multinational business background. And the importance of having
the same kind of
standards that are predictable. So when you make decisions at board meetings that may not get implemented for a few quarters,
I'm just asking
you know
from a
that nothing has really moved around too much in terms of
agree that
your due diligence and how you make your decisions.
As robust as
we did have a
the
jump
CFIUS process
that was,
or the amended
that was
CFIUS
flagged. In terms of the amount of
my concerns lie in the analysis.
The amount of review cases
and you've also
went from
stated
1%
that in your
to
opinion,
9% in a fiscal year
that our bureaucracy
2018-19.
doesn't have
They were up from
sufficient
4%
resources
in previous years.
To
so there was a
screen and
change
look
there.
into
There was a
investments.
jump.
What
Do you
is
know
that
what the
based
background was there in terms of why we're doing more reviews?
My adult life is almost entirely China. So when I speak about that,
sure there was
I'm
necessarily a jump.
And in that regard, linguistic challenges, cultural challenges,
of net benefit
you can't come into an organization, say public safety,
because the
and understand the nuances and complexities of how FCOEs operate, how the party operates, party committees and private companies. That is where I think that cadre, and I don't know the numbers, but I've got some reasons to believe that we need to build that capacity.
However,
starts in our universities,
in the number of national security reviews.
Unfortunately, that is all the time for that round. We're now moved to MP Gray. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Right, and the value was part of the change as well. The amount of dollars exchanged was higher, if I remember the report.
I clicked it. There we go.
Thresholds do go up each year.
I wanted to ask some questions today for Mr. Holden. I know that another witness here this afternoon went into detail about the foreign takeover of nursing homes gone wrong with En Bong and which owns Retirement Concepts, a company with private long-term care facilities throughout the country, 20 of which are in British Columbia. And this was approved by the federal government and by Minister Baines himself, who scrutinized it under the Investment Review Division because it exceeded the dollar threshold. And we heard from other witnesses, and we know that as part of the Investment Canada Act, that reviews can occur at discretion of the minister. So considering this and based on your experience, is there a lot of subjectivity around this? And are there some other parameters that we should be considering when we're looking outside of just the dollar value for consideration?
Or if we introduce some type of social benefit that needs to be included in the way businesses operate.
They began to realize there was
Is there something where you have to go back and say, okay, business like stability, if you change some legislation or regulations,
in retrospect,
terms of the investments, do you ever go back on those and look at that and see whether it would still meet the current criteria?
Have the capacity and the experience and
in practical terms, probably not.
Aged people.
The reality is that most undertakings given by investors
looking back at the time,
3 years.
I didn't think that was probably crystal clear.
For
now,
that period of
out
time,
of the area of expertise,
people are operating under a set of
changing
laws
the way in which
and
the review
regulations
process is done.
that they assume
You'd
will
have
be
to look at qualitative
constant.
capacity of the incoming company.
One thing that interrupt in terms of our trade agreements, it's very, very important that we stay constant because of the agreements.
Can this company
absolutely our trade partners trust us to provide a stable framework for them to invest and likewise for us to invest in their countries.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me 3 extra seconds there.
If you're looking
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to Deputy
Lemire. And sort of moving forward to that, using that as an example or perhaps other examples, do you think that there should be some type of standards for these state-owned enterprises that should result in some type of action if there are issues that come out of previous investments from these companies? Is there some type of recourse or some type of action down the road for future investments that you would consider?
I would think that would be reasonable. In other words, if you've done badly and you want to come back to the well, and we may be concerned that you do badly again. One small point, I think you have to be just as hard on Canadian companies. You get into difficulties than otherwise of discrimination under international trade agreements. So we don't want to get a situation where we give the Chinese a good excuse to beat up on a company. They may anyways. But I'd argue high standards for us, high standards for them.
Can you hear me? They're being looked
at. Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions for Ms. Travers now from Unite Here.
What sort of level
I know
of
that
due
in
diligence
your testimony and in some of the other questions you went into the issue of with the hotel industry and with a cyber attack, and you went into some explanation there. But I'm wondering if from your perspective on with all of your members, how this affects them from also from a worker's point of view, but also from a business point of view, and also from a customer's point of view. Knowing that you have a hotel chain that might potentially be owned, from a state-owned enterprise, and if there's a cyber attack, what are the various concerns that you've seen around that?
There's got to be some process for being able to look more closely. I think it's one of the things where how these deals are scrutinized. People want more tools to be able to say, look, that review process. They want to make
Ms. Travis, I'm sorry to disturb. Could you just put your mic a little closer, please?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think in terms of with the Marriott situation, again, I'm just using this as an example. It was alarming, I think, to folks to understand the scale and the reach of that
situation. Are your members concerned with the possibility of getting hostile offers coming from other countries?
You have a company like Blue Sky, where we don't know whether Ambon really owns that company or not. There is a question about how is your information at
is
risk
inspired from the anti-takeover American measures to protect them.
That company. So I think once an attack happens, people
once the pandemic unfolded and the initial economic hit was evident, yes, there was concern as we saw valuations decline. So that's why we've supported the temporary and very important temporary measures to make sure that companies aren't.
So I think that's just to say it's always a concern, but I think it's one of those things where we have to be proactive about it to avoid a situation from happening.
And our next round of questions goes to MP Massey. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for that slot. And we will now move to MP Longfield. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
To Ms. Travis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we could do with a few more hours with all these witnesses. Thank you all for coming with all your expertise. I'd like to start off with Mr. Holden and then follow up with a question around trade with Mr. Glossop. Mr. Holden, when we talk about the acquisition of a long-term care facility,
they're doing payouts.
Part of the conditions
others are public
have to do cross-jurisdictional with the provinces who have full jurisdiction over long-term care and whether it's a viable business and to do an evaluation. We had a testimony earlier in the study that just briefly mentioned cross-jurisdictional matters. Could you maybe expand on that just for 30 seconds or so, please?
Is the state government of the Chinese, then if a cyber attack takes place, then we may never know, again, the full exposure or what they do about it, whether it's an internal problem that led to something that's far more spectacular than we would think, or whether or not it's, I guess, something that led past because they have other national interests.
They need to be brought in and allowed to provide their opinions before an investment goes forward.
Yes, at this point, we don't really have any clarity a lot of that is confidential on any of those questions, so which is because why it's so important to understand what kind of privacy protocols.
And that is one of the challenges. If they don't see it, they may not believe it happened, and that is a fair point.
like
yes,
that.
Thank you.
I think
we saw that in our first panel too, that a lot of these matters are confidential.
Under PIPEDA, there's a business transaction exemption
with Mr. Glossop,
which allows parties to share personal
I'm not coming from a legal background. I'm coming more from a multinational business background.
I think there's a question
and the importance of having standards that are predictable. So when you make decisions at board meetings that may not get implemented for a few quarters, that you know that nothing has really moved around too much in terms of your due diligence and how you make your decisions. We did have a jump that was flagged in terms of the amount
of
the
government maintain some sort of ongoing review to
the amount of review cases that went from 1% to 9% in a fiscal year 2018-19. They were up from 4% in previous years. So there was a change there. There was a jump.
Thank you very much.
Do you know what the background was there in terms of why we're doing more reviews?
MP Van Popta, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
There was necessarily a jump.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Generally been
my question is going to be for Professor Holden.
Net benefit reviews.
Professor, you had stated that you might be more nervous about the acquisition of a smallish Canadian company that has important IP that would leak out of the country. I think you had used a hypothetical example of going out in a briefcase.
There has
maybe more realistically,
interestingly, however, been an increase in the number of
do you think that would be fair to say that
so I think
the dollar
threshold
in the Investment Canada Act is maybe not always the appropriate measure?
Right, and the value was part of the change.
The national security review can be applied in any
amount of dollars exchanging
for small transactions, and that's why I think
higher. If
some of the real dangers.
The thresholds do go up each year. They're not that significant. It does depend very much on what it is, flow of transactions from year to year.
These small companies, often led by a brilliant individual who's come up with a great innovation, they don't know often that much necessarily even about business
and here we're only talking about
let alone
very
about
significant
China.
transactions.
They are vulnerable. Or you may have someone who's just looking at dollar signs and saying, I'm going to sell this out.
The retrospective review, if there is one,
he's been maybe working in collaboration with a Chinese firm.
The last discussion
where
we just had about
that widget or that thing.
A transaction that really didn't end up in Canada's interest. I've asked this in a few different ways with other witnesses. But looking at critical infrastructure and technology,
where there already is ecosystem.
Is there a means for us to look at what was acceptable in 2020 may not be acceptable in 2025 if environmental regulations, for instance, take a jump,
Mr. Balsley
or if we introduce some type of social benefit that needs to be included in the way businesses operate.
Innovators.
Is there something where you have to go back and say, okay, business like stability, if you change some legislation or regulations,
he talks about
terms of the investments, do you ever go back on those and look at that and see whether it would still meet your criteria?
I want to know if you agree with that. I'm going to put the same question to the two CBA.
The reality is that most undertakings
so this is what
given
Mr.
by
Balsley
investors
said the Act is based on the premise that with the FDI, the direction of the flow of knowledge and technology is into Canada. This used to be the case with FDI into industrial production. It is not the case with FDI into the innovation.
In terms of our trade agreements, it's very, very important that we stay constant because of the agreements we have in place.
Absolutely. Our trade partners trust us to provide a stable framework for them to invest and likewise for us to invest in their countries.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me three extra seconds.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to Député Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Ma première question est pour Madame Travis. Vous avez mentionné dans votre allocution que, en fait, vous avez posé une question dont j'aimerais que vous puissiez amener une réponse. Vous avez posé la question, est-ce que le gouvernement évalue de manière rigoureuse les avantages nets du Canada? Vous avez fait état de la transparence, des éléments déclencheurs et des recours possibles. Est-ce que vous avez le sentiment que cette évaluation rigoureuse se fait et que notre loi est suffisamment adaptée et a suffisamment de moyens?
What I'd add, though, is that there are other
tools in the toolbox too, perhaps more precise or surgical tools, including things like the export control list, the controlled goods regulations, and other statutory instruments. We know a lot about the Investment Canada Act.
Can you hear me?
It's very well known. It meets the headlines. What sort
of level of due diligence is taking place when looking at a transaction? What questions are being asked when looking at how does this affect Canadian workers or other stakeholders, customers, anyone who's going to be affected by the transaction?
Any comments on that?
Would like to be able to see more transparency.
No,
in the
I
process,
appreciate
and
that
also
we
what are the commitments that
a little bit light on time, and I would echo everything that Mike just said, including his last point, which I think is a key point for this committee to consider.
Of living up to the commitments that what we expect.
Well, while I'm talking with you, Ms. Salzberger, I think that you had said that
how do we have an opportunity
Canada might benefit from a better definition of what is critical industries. If you didn't say that, I'm going to ask you the question anyways.
So I think
we benefit from more detailed, exhaustive list of what actually is to be identified as a critical industry that is subject to a greater degree of scrutiny?
To be able to say, look, that review process didn't make sense going forward.
I don't believe I did say that. If I did, I think it was misunderstood. I think what I would say, though, is that we would benefit from additional guidance.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais me permettre une question rapide pour Monsieur Kingston. Est-ce que vos membres ont une inquiétude par rapport à la possibilité de recevoir des offres hostiles, par exemple, venant d'autres pays? Est-ce qu'on devrait ajuster notre loi en fonction de tenir compte de l'abolition des droits de vote des acquéreurs et s'inspirer davantage des mesures anti-takeover américains?
Additional guidance, but to have an exhaustive definition of what constitutes national security, I think is inflexible.
Thank you so much. The pandemic unfolded and the initial economic
that brings us to the end of our meeting today. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us and your excellent testimony. Again, thanking our clerk, our analysts, and IT and interpretation staff that are helping make this possible. Thank you so much. And with that, I call this meeting adjourned.
Non-commercial actors.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. And our next round of questions goes to MP Massé. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to return to the hotel and the cyber attack, actually, to Ms. Travis, because I think that there's a couple of things with cyber attacks that are taking place we don't really have, and we had some good testimony, and now this committee before that, is that those that are cyber attacked right now, there is some are settling behind the scenes with no accountability as to the data that has been breached, and they're doing payouts. And others are public institutions that have had cyber attacks that have made settlements as well too. Some have brought in the police, some have not. And this has been the feedback we've got. I guess the question to you is that with regards to this one that took place, and even further in the future, I guess if the hotel ownership is the state government of the Chinese, then if a cyber attack takes place, then we may never know, again, the full exposure or what they do about it, whether it's an internal problem that led to something that's far more spectacular than we would think, or whether or not it's, I guess, something they let pass because they have other national interests.
Yes, at this point, I mean, we don't really have any clarity on any of those questions, and I think it's why it's so important to understand what kind of privacy protocols does Canada expect in the course of a foreign takeover like that. I think one of the other questions I would just raise would be under PIPEDA, there's a business transaction exemption, which allows parties to share personal information for due diligence purposes without having to obtain consent for sharing information. So I think there's a question about if the party that's buying the Canadian company has some tie to the Chinese government or another actor that's problematic. What sort of controls are put in place to make sure that information is making sure sensitive information isn't shared that shouldn't be shared, and how does the government maintain some sort of ongoing review to make sure that that information is protected on an ongoing basis?
Great, thank you. I know that I'm out of time. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses again.
Thank you very much. And our last round of questions will go to MP Van Popta. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is going to be for Professor Holden. Professor, you had stated that you might be more nervous about the acquisition of a smallish Canadian company that has important IP that would leak out of the country. I think you had used a hypothetical example of going out in a briefcase, or maybe more realistically on an optic fiber. Do you think that would be fair to say that the dollar threshold in the Investment Canada Act is maybe not always the appropriate measure?
I would agree. I think that of course, the National Security Review can be applied in any instance, even for small transactions. And that's where I think some of the real dangers appear. A mine, I mean, let's put aside all the environmental other issues. A mine, you know where the product is, you know what it is, where it's going, very well understood. These small companies, often led by a brilliant individual who's come up with a great innovation, they don't know often that much necessarily even about business internationally, let alone about China. They are vulnerable. Or you may have someone who's just looking at dollar signs and saying, I'm going to sell this out. Similar challenge, you have a professor came up with a great agreement. He's been maybe working in collaboration with a Chinese firm. Where are they going to manufacture that widget or that thing? It's not going to be, with all due respect to my hometown of Calgary, it's not going to be in Calgary or Edmonton or in Prince George. It's going to be in Hangzhou or Ningbo or Guangzhou, where there already is an ecosystem for manufacturing. That is a challenge even for academic collaborations, as well as for those small companies that are looking for joint ventures.
Good. Thank you for that. Mr. Balsillie was here the other day in front of this committee. He's the chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators, and he's advocating for amendments to the Investment Canada Act to keep pace with Canada's digital economy. He talks about IP leakage. And I have a quote from him, which I just want to read to you, and I want to know if you agree with that. And I'm going to put the same question to the two CBA lawyers as well. So this is what Mr. Balsillie said. He said, the Act is based on the premise that with the FDI, the direction of the flow of knowledge and technology is into Canada. This used to be the case with FDI into industrial production. It is not the case with FDI into the innovation economy where FDI is extractive. Do you agree with that?
Fundamentally, I would. Intellectual property and knowledge is flowing in both directions. China is producing 5 times as many STEM graduates in the United States right now. We need to tap into that. But in looking at an individual deal, we need to make sure that we're not allowing what are still pretty small pools of innovation compared to China or compared to the United States, that we're not allowing those to just evaporate or disappear.
Good. Maybe I could put the same question to start with Mr. Kilby.
Sure, thank you. So I think certainly the Investment Canada Act is one important tool in the toolbox in that regard, and in particular the national security provisions. As we've heard, they're very broad in scope. They can be used in the discretion, the unfettered discretion of the government to prevent transactions that it views as problematic from a national security perspective. What I'd add, though, is that there are other tools in the toolbox too, perhaps more precise or surgical tools, including things like the export control list, the controlled goods regulations, and other statutory instruments. You know, we know a lot about the Investment Canada Act. It's very well known. It meets the headlines, but there are other tools that can be used as well to control technology transfer and who is entitled to own or transfer or possess goods in Canada. Technology.
Okay, good, thank you. Ms. Sulzberger, any comments on that?
No, I appreciate that we are a little bit light on time, and I would echo everything that Mike just said, including his last point, which I think is a key point for this committee to consider.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, while I'm talking with you, Ms. Sulzberger, I think that you had said that Canada might benefit from a better definition of what is critical industries. Or if you didn't say that, I'm going to ask you the question anyways. Would we benefit from a more detailed, exhaustive list of what actually is to be identified as a critical industry that is subject to a greater degree of scrutiny?
Thank you for your question. I don't believe I did say that.
All right.
If I did, I think it was misunderstood. I think what I would say, though, is that we would benefit from additional guidance in respect of what types of industries might be considered critical industries for the purposes of national security reviews. And I say that only to benefit the knowledge base, and transparency is a point that's been raised throughout this discussion. For the benefit of transparency, for the benefit of understanding what might be in scope, I think it would be helpful to have additional guidance, but to have an exhaustive definition of what constitutes national security, I think is inflexible.
Good, thanks. We're out of time, so thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our meeting today. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us and your excellent testimony. Again, thanking our clerk, our analysts, and IT and interpretation staff that are helping make this possible. Thank you so much. And with that, I call this meeting adjourned.
Thank you.